The parlour smells of beeswax and old roses. It is 1889 and the gas lamps are burning low along the side table. A woman sits in a chair near the window, not the window that faces the street, but the one that looks inward toward the garden, where the last light of a September afternoon is fading into grey. She's wearing silk, dark as plum, and her hands are folded in her lap with the particular stillness of a person who has learned to wait. She's waiting for a voice. Not the voice of her husband, who is downstairs in his study with the door closed. Not the voice of her daughter, who is away at school in Philadelphia. She is waiting for the voice of someone who has already left this world. A mother, perhaps, or a father, or the brother who died of fever before he turned 30. She's waiting to be told something she cannot be told by anyone still living. She's waiting for proof that the people she has loved did not simply vanish. The medium will arrive at 7. There is tea on the table, the curtains are drawn, the servants have been dismissed for the evening. This is how it begins, not with darkness or mystery or any of the theatrical trappings the newspapers love to mock. It begins quietly, in a warm room, with a grieving woman who wants to believe. And in the years that follow, what she believes will change everything. If you enjoy listening to sleep stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly. There is a particular quality to grief in the Gilded Age that is difficult to name from the outside. It was not simply the grief of losing someone. It was the grief of losing someone in a world that had no patience for grief. A world of acquisition, and expansion, and upward motion. Where sentiment was a private matter to be folded away with the mourning clothes and the black-edged stationery once the prescribed period had passed. The wealthy women of the 1880s and 1890s occupied a strange position in American life. They were central to everything and peripheral to everything at the same time. Their households ran because of their management, their social calendars, their careful navigation of the invisible codes that separated the acceptable from the unacceptable, and yet they owned almost nothing in a legal sense. Their money was their husband's money, their property was their husband's property. The decisions that shaped their lives were made by fathers and husbands and lawyers and trustees, by men who managed estates and signed documents and sat on the boards of banks. In this world, the spiritualist offered something remarkable. She, and it was usually a she, though not always, offered access. She offered the possibility of communication with the one realm that operated outside the legal and financial structures of everyday life. The dead could not be controlled by trustees. The spirits, if they existed, answered to no probate court. A message from beyond the grave was not a legal document, but in a culture that took such messages seriously, it carried a weight that no living attorney could easily dismiss. Spiritualism had arrived in America in 1848, in a farmhouse in Hydesville, New York, where two sisters named Kate and Maggie Fox claimed to have made contact with a spirit through a series of raps and knocks. The story spread with remarkable speed. Within a decade, there were spiritualist societies in every major American city, publishing houses devoted entirely to spiritualist literature, and a population of mediums ranging from sincere believers to accomplished frauds operating in parlours from Boston to San Francisco. By the 1880s, spiritualism had woven itself into the fabric of upper-class American life, with a thoroughness that later generations would find difficult to believe. It was not a fringe movement. It was not confined to the credulous or the uneducated. Some of the most prominent families in the country consulted mediums with the same regularity that they consulted physicians or lawyers. Mary Todd Lincoln, still grieving the death of her son Willie, and living in the White House under the shadow of a war that was consuming the nation, invited mediums to hold séances in the Red Room. The poet William Cullen Bryant attended spiritualist demonstrations. The author James Fenimore Cooper, near the end of his life, expressed genuine interest in the communications being reported from the other side. In the gilded parlours of Fifth Avenue and Boston's Back Bay, and the brownstones of Washington, D.C., the medium was a familiar figure, invited for an evening, paid handsomely, treated with a mixture of hope and wariness. The women who consulted them were not foolish. They were in many cases among the most educated and observant people in the country. They were simply searching, as people in every era search, for something the visible world could not supply. And they were also increasingly searching for leverage. This is the part of the story that the histories of spiritualism tend to overlook, perhaps because it is uncomfortable, perhaps because it does not fit the narrative of innocent believers deceived by cynical frauds. The truth is more complicated than that. In the world of Gilded Age inheritance and estate law, in a culture where women's legal rights were limited and contested, in a society where vast fortunes could be redirected by a single sentence in a will, the medium occupied a position of extraordinary potential power. A medium who could produce a message from a dead patriarch, endorsing the claims of his widow or daughter, was not merely a comfort, she was a weapon. And in the decades between the end of the Civil War and the First World War, that weapon was deployed with striking frequency in the drawing rooms of the wealthy, in the offices of lawyers, in the courtrooms where the estates of the dead were contested by the living. The women at the centre of these stories were not passive. They were not simply victims of grief or delusion or manipulation. They were, in many cases, the architects of strategies that were breathtaking in their audacity. Women who understood the legal structures that constrained them and found, in the figure of the medium, a tool for working around those structures in ways that left their male adversaries without any effective response. To dispute a message from the dead was to invite the question of what one believed about death itself. To challenge a medium in court was to expose oneself to the charge of irreverence, of materialism, of a kind of spiritual poverty that sat poorly with the religious tone of the age. And so the men who found themselves on the wrong end of a spirit message, the disappointed brothers and neglected sons and ambitious nephews, were left in a remarkably uncomfortable position. They could not simply say the medium was lying without inviting the counter-argument that they were lying too. They could not dismiss the claims without appearing to dismiss the possibility of life after death, which no respectable person in the 1880s was willing to do openly. They were trapped in an argument they could not win, and the women who had hired the medium knew it. This is the world we're entering tonight. Not a world of simple fraud or simple belief, but a world of genuine grief and calculated strategy, of hope and manipulation, of women who found in the parlour séance something that their lawyers could not find for them in the probate courts. Let us begin with the houses. The houses of the Gilded Age had a particular quality of interiority that is worth understanding before anything else. They were designed not merely as dwellings, but as theatres of social performance, with rooms that had specific purposes and specific rules about who could occupy them and under what circumstances. The parlour was the room for receiving guests. The drawing room was for more intimate gatherings. The study was the man's domain. The boudoir was the woman's. But there was another room in many of these houses, one that does not appear on the official floor plans. The room set aside for the medium's visits, wherever that happened to be. A back parlour, perhaps, with the gas lamps turned down and the furniture pushed to the edges. Or a library, with the curtains drawn against the evening light. Or sometimes the dining room, with the chairs arranged in a circle and the table cleared of everything except a single candle. These rooms were transformed for the evening into something else. Not a domestic space and not a religious space, but something in between. A threshold place where the ordinary rules of domestic life were temporarily suspended. The servants were sent away. The children were put to bed. The husband might be present or might be carefully absent, depending on his views and the purpose of the gathering. And into this room would come the medium. She might be a woman in her 50s with the comfortable manner of an experienced nurse, projecting warmth and practical efficiency. Or she might be younger, with an otherworldly quality carefully cultivated through her clothing and manner. She might speak in a low, measured voice, or she might work in silence, her hands spread flat on the table, her eyes closed, her breathing gradually slowing until the room itself seemed to hold its breath. What happened next varied enormously, depending on the medium, the client, and the particular tradition being practiced. There were table tippers, and automatic writers, and trance speakers, and materialization mediums who claimed to produce physical manifestations of spirit presences, moving objects, voices from the air, hands that could be touched. There were mediums who claimed to channel specific spirits, and those who served as general receivers, transmitting whatever messages came through from the collective dead. But beneath all this variety lay a common structure. The client had lost someone. The medium would bring that someone back, if only in words. And the words that came back would carry the weight of a certainty that no living person could provide. The certainty of someone who had passed through death and seen what lay on the other side. In the years after the Civil War, that certainty was desperately needed. The country had lost 600,000 men in 4 years. There was almost no family in America, north or south, wealthy or poor, that had not lost someone in those 4 years. The grief was enormous and the mechanisms for processing it were inadequate. The churches offered consolation, but the consolation of theology could feel abstract and cold compared to the direct personal communication the medium promised. And so the mediums prospered. They prospered most of all among the wealthy, who could afford their fees and whose losses were large enough to justify them. A woman who had inherited $5 million from a dead husband was a much more promising client than a woman who had inherited a frame house and a garden, not merely because she could pay more, though she could, but because the stakes of the inheritance question were large enough to make the medium's claims worth investigating, worth cultivating, worth building a long and careful relationship around. In the parlours of Manhattan, women sat across small tables from women who claimed to speak for the dead, and in the space between them, in the flickering candlelight, in the silence before the medium began to speak, something was negotiated that was more complex than simple belief or simple fraud. It was the negotiation of a world where women had limited power and unlimited need, where the legal structures of the day left vast wealth in the hands of men who might not share it willingly, and where a voice from the dead could accomplish what no living voice could manage. The voice of the dead could redirect a fortune. And the women who understood this, who had seen it done or heard of it being done, or who had simply arrived at the same conclusion through their own observation of how the world worked, these women became something more than clients. They became strategists. They became the women at the centre of this story. There was one woman in Gilded Age America who needed no medium to manage her fortune, and her name was Hetty Green. Hetty Green was, by any measure, the wealthiest woman in the United States during the last decades of the 19th century, and possibly the wealthiest woman in the world. She had inherited money from her father, Edward Mott Robinson, who had made a fortune in the whaling business in New Bedford, Massachusetts. She had also inherited, or attempted to inherit, money from her aunt Sylvia Ann Howland. And the dispute over that second inheritance became one of the most extraordinary legal battles in American history, a battle that involved a forged will, a pioneering application of statistical analysis, and a medium who claimed to have received messages from the dead, Sylvia Ann Howland endorsing a document that Hetty had conveniently produced. Hetty Green was not a romantic figure. She was small, dark-eyed, ferociously intelligent and almost aggressively uninterested in the social performances that consumed most women of her class. She dressed in black clothes that she wore until they were threadbare. She ate oatmeal from a tin pail to avoid the cost of restaurant meals. She was famously reluctant to spend money on anything that was not strictly necessary, including her son Ned's medical care. A story that has been told and retold until it has become almost mythological, the dark legend at the centre of her story. But in the matter of her aunt Sylvia Ann Howland's estate, Hetty Green displayed a strategic cunning that was far more interesting than the myths about her miserliness. Sylvia Ann Howland died in 1865, leaving an estate worth approximately $2 million. Hetty had expected to inherit the bulk of it. The will that was filed for probate gave her approximately $1 million outright, with the remainder going to various charities and distant relatives. Hetty was not satisfied. She produced a second document, an earlier codicil to the will, she claimed, that left everything to her. The executors of the estate disputed its authenticity. They hired experts to examine the signature. And in a development that seemed almost supernatural in its implications, a statistician named Benjamin Pierce, working at Harvard, analysed the handwriting and concluded that the probability of the signature being genuine was astronomically small. The disputed document, he argued, had been traced. It was a forgery. It was in this context that spiritualism made its appearance. Hetty was not, by temperament or inclination, a woman who believed in séances. She was too practical for that, too suspicious of any claim that could not be verified by the hard evidence of a bank ledger. But she understood perfectly well what a message from the dead Sylvia Ann Howland could accomplish. If such a message endorsed the disputed codicil, or at least expressed the late Sylvia Ann's wish that Hetty should receive the full estate, it would complicate the legal proceedings enormously. A medium named Eliza Prentice appeared in New Bedford during the months of the estate dispute. She claimed to have received communications from Sylvia Ann Howland, confirming that the codicil represented her true wishes. She gave testimony and affidavits. She held séances at which Sylvia Ann Howland's spirit was said to speak directly through her. The executors of the estate were not moved by these communications. They proceeded with their case. The court sided with them. Hetty lost the battle over the disputed codicil and was forced to accept the lesser inheritance. But the episode is instructive for what it reveals about the strategic use of spiritualism in inheritance disputes. Even Hetty Green, the most hard-headed and unsentimental woman of the Gilded Age, understood the potential leverage of a spirit message, even if she ultimately deployed it without success. The medium was not just a comfort, she was a legal instrument, or an attempt at one, and the fact that she failed in this case does not diminish the audacity of the attempt. What Hetty Green's story illuminates, in its cold and practical way, is the underlying logic that drove dozens of less famous women to their own, more successful deployments of the same strategy. The medium was not merely a source of consolation. She was potentially a way of reaching across the boundary of death to accomplish what could not be accomplished on this side of it. Hetty Green died in 1916, worth approximately $100 million, the largest fortune ever accumulated by a woman in American history up to that point. She left it to her 2 children, who spent it with the thoroughness and creativity that their mother had always denied herself. Within a generation, the Green fortune was gone. But before it was gone, it stood as proof of what a woman could accomplish with financial intelligence and an absolute refusal to be managed by anyone, living or dead. The women in the other houses of the Gilded Age took note. To understand how spiritualism wove itself into the fabric of the Vanderbilt fortune, it is necessary to begin not with a medium, but with a steamship. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the original Commodore, the one who built the fortune, was a man of enormous practical intelligence and almost no formal education. He had grown up poor, had worked the ferries of New York Harbor as a teenager, and had accumulated, through a combination of physical courage, financial shrewdness, and a willingness to work longer and harder than anyone around him, a fortune that had few precedents in American history. By the time of his death in 1877, he was worth between $90 and $100 million, a sum so large that it dwarfed the assets of the United States government itself at certain points during his career. He was also, in the last decades of his life, one of the most enthusiastic consumers of spiritualist services in the country. This is not the version of Cornelius Vanderbilt that most people know. The Commodore is usually presented as a man of iron practicality, a builder and accumulator who had no patience for sentiment or superstition. And this version is not entirely wrong. He was those things. But he was also a man who, in his 70s, with his first wife dead and his second wife nearly 30 years younger than he was, found himself drawn to the parlour séance with a frequency and intensity that his family found alarming. The medium who occupied the central position in the Commodore's spiritual life was a woman named Tennessee Celeste Claflin, one half of a remarkable pair of sisters who arrived in New York in 1868 and proceeded to insert themselves into the upper reaches of the city's financial and social life with a speed and thoroughness that astonished everyone who witnessed it. Tennessee and her sister Victoria Woodhull as she would become known, were the daughters of a man who had raised them on the road, working carnivals and travelling medicine shows in the Midwest, where Tennessee served as a healer and Victoria as a clairvoyant. They arrived in New York with almost nothing and left it, several years later, having established the first female-owned brokerage house on Wall Street, having published a newspaper that was among the most radical in the country, having advocated publicly for free love and the rights of women, and having become, briefly, the most talked about women in America. The mechanism of their rise was Cornelius Vanderbilt. Tennessee had established herself as a magnetic healer, a practitioner of the magnetic therapy that was then fashionable among those who believed in the electrical or magnetic properties of the human body. Vanderbilt was old, infirm, and in pain, and he was susceptible to the ministrations of an attractive young woman who promised to ease his suffering. He was also susceptible to her sister's clairvoyance and to the broader world of spiritualist communication that the two sisters inhabited with such apparent ease. The relationship between Vanderbilt and the Claflin sisters was the subject of enormous gossip during the years of its flourishing. It was said that Tennessee gave him daily massages, It was said that Victoria channeled his dead mother's spirit during séances at which Vanderbilt received business advice from beyond the grave. It was said, more seriously, that the Commodore used the sisters' clairvoyant services to guide his stock market investments, and that the information they provided, whether obtained through genuine intuition through superior social intelligence, or through networks of informants, was accurate enough to be genuinely valuable. What is not in dispute is that Vanderbilt gave the sisters money, enough to establish their brokerage house, enough to publish their newspaper, enough to live well in a brownstone on Murray Hill, while the rest of the city watched and speculated about the nature of the arrangement. What is also not in dispute is that the Vanderbilt family and his children and grandchildren, and the enormous cast of relatives who had every reason to be concerned about where the Commodore's money was going, watched the sisters' influence with growing alarm. William Henry Vanderbilt, the Commodore's eldest surviving son, was a sensible and capable man who had spent his career managing the railroad operations that his father had assembled. He understood money. He understood, with uncomfortable clarity, that the $100 million his father controlled was being nibbled at by two women who had appeared from nowhere and installed themselves in the old man's trust. He understood, too, that the legal structures of the day gave him almost no recourse, as long as his father was alive and competent. He could not prevent the gifts. He could not intercept the bank transfers. He could not revoke the access to the brokerage accounts that the sisters had opened with Vanderbilt Capital. All he could do was wait and manage and hope that the influence would wane before it had consumed too much of the principal. The influence did not wane. When Cornelius Vanderbilt died in January of 1877, the contest over his estate began almost immediately, and it lasted in various forms for years. The will he left was very largely in favour of William Henry, who received the bulk of the railroad properties and the liquid assets that sustained them. The other children received comparatively modest sums, and the Claflin sisters received nothing, or at least nothing that was openly acknowledged in the probate documents. But Victoria Woodhull, who had moved to England by the time of the Commodore's death and had reinvented herself as a respectable society figure, was said to possess documents that her sister Tennessee had obtained during the years of her relationship with the Commodore, documents that, if genuine, suggested a promise of much more than what the will provided. She did not press her claims publicly, or not in a way that created lasting legal complications. The Vanderbilt family, with its enormous resources and its formidable legal team, was not an adversary that the Claflin sisters could easily challenge directly. But the episode, the years of Tennessee's influence, the séances in which Victoria channeled the Commodore's dead mother, the advice taken from spirits and from clairvoyants and from women who moved in the borderland between the visible world and the invisible one, established a pattern that would repeat itself in the great houses of the Gilded Age for decades to come. The very wealthy were vulnerable to the medium, not because they were credulous, though some of them were, but because the medium offered something that no lawyer or banker or family member could provide, a connection to the dead, and through that connection, a potential renegotiation of what the dead had left behind. And once this had been demonstrated, once it became known that the Commodore had taken spirit advice seriously, that the disposition of his enormous fortune had been influenced, however marginally, by communications from the other side, every medium in New York understood that the parlours of the wealthy were the most valuable real estate in the city. The women who hired them understood it too. The game was about to become more complicated, more calculated, and considerably more interesting. Before we go further into the specific histories, it is worth pausing to understand what belief in spiritualism actually felt like from the inside. What it was like to be a woman in 1885 or 1890 who took seriously the possibility that the dead could communicate with the living. The first thing to understand is that this belief did not exist in isolation. It was embedded in a broader framework of religious and philosophical thought that was, in that era, considerably more open to the possibility of the invisible than our own moment tends to be. The Victorian and Edwardian eras were not secular in the way that the late 20th century was secular. They were eras of intense religious inquiry, of serious philosophical debate about the nature of consciousness and its relationship to the physical body, of genuine scientific uncertainty about the boundaries of what was possible. The theory of evolution, which Darwin had published in 1859, had not settled the question of the soul. It had, if anything, made the question more pressing, by suggesting that the human mind had arisen through entirely natural processes, which raised the uncomfortable possibility that it might also be extinguished through entirely natural processes, without any survival into another state of being. The religious traditions of the time offered reassurance on this point, but the reassurance of tradition was, for many thoughtful people, no longer entirely satisfying. They wanted evidence. Spiritualism offered evidence. Not conclusive evidence, not the kind of evidence that would satisfy a modern scientific standard, but the kind of evidence that was available given the tools and methods of the period, the testimony of witnesses, the record of phenomena that seemed to exceed mundane explanation, the reports of communications that contained information the medium could not have possessed through ordinary means. For women who were already accustomed to operating in a world where the most important things, love, loyalty, the quality of a person's character, the sincerity of their commitments, were known through means that could not be scientifically verified, the evidence of spiritualism did not seem categorically different from the evidence of ordinary life. You knew that your husband loved you, not because you had measured it, but because of 1,000 things. The tone of his voice, the way he looked at you across a room, the specific manner in which he remembered what you had said 3 weeks ago about something that seemed insignificant at the time. None of this was measurable. All of it was real. The evidence of a séance had the same quality, the medium knowing the pet name that only the dead man had used, the specific memory of a particular afternoon that no one outside the marriage could have known, the manner of speaking that was so like his manner, the slightly impatient way of circling back to the main point after a digression. These were not measurements, they were recognitions, and the women who recognized them were using the same faculty of perception they used in all their most important knowledge, the perception that comes from long attention to another person, the perception that is the product of love. Whether this perception was accurate about the spirit is not the question right now. The question is whether it was real as an experience, and the answer to that question is clearly yes. The women who recognized the voice of the dead in a medium's communication were experiencing something genuine, whatever its ultimate source. They were experiencing recognition. They were experiencing, briefly and imperfectly, the sense of continued connection that grief had interrupted. This is not a trivial thing to provide. There are people in every culture and every era who would give almost anything for it. The medium provided it, imperfectly and at a price, but she provided it. And the women who came to her were not passive recipients of what she offered. They were active participants in a practice that they shaped and directed and, in the cases we have been examining, deployed with considerable strategic intelligence. The belief and the strategy were not separate. The belief was what made the strategy available. A woman who did not believe, even partially, in the possibility of spirit communication could not have used the medium as effectively as the women in these stories did, because the effectiveness of the strategy depended on the woman's own conviction communicating itself to the people around her. A performance of belief that was entirely cynical would have been detectable as such. What moved the uncles and the brothers and the trustees was not the medium's words alone, but the woman's own relationship to those words, the sense that she genuinely believed in what was being communicated, that her claims were rooted in something she actually felt to be true. The strategy worked because the belief was real. Even when the strategy was self-conscious and calculated, it was built on a foundation of genuine experience. That is what made it impossible for the adversaries to simply dismiss it. They could not dismiss the medium without seeming to dismiss the woman's genuine grief and her genuine experience of contact with the dead she had loved. And that dismissal carried a cost that most of them were not willing to pay. The drawing rooms of the Gilded Age were full of women who understood this dynamic intuitively, who had spent their lives navigating a world where their perceptions were routinely undervalued and their authority was routinely questioned, and who had found in the specific context of the séance a space where those perceptions could not be dismissed in the usual ways. This space was valuable. They protected it. They used it with care and with purpose. And the purposes it served were not merely strategic. They were human. They were the purposes of grief and love and the unwillingness to accept that the people who had mattered most were simply gone. Both things were true at the same time, in the same women, in the same drawing rooms. The grief was real, and the strategy was real, and the belief was real, and the calculation was real. This is what it means to be a whole person navigating the world with the tools you have, It is worth understanding the economics of the medium's practice before we proceed, because the economics illuminate the social position she occupied and the constraints within which she worked. Mediums in the Gilded Age operated at many different price points. At the lower end, there were public demonstrations at which anyone willing to pay a modest admission fee could attend and observe the phenomena: table tipping, automatic writing, the production of spirit messages, and occasionally receive a personal communication. These demonstrations were the entry point for many clients, the place where interest was first aroused, and the question of private consultation was first raised. Private consultations were considerably more expensive. A session with a well-regarded medium in New York or Boston in the 1880s might cost anywhere from $5 to $50, depending on the medium's reputation and the complexity of what was being requested. For a working-class woman, even $5 was a significant sum. For the women of the wealthy class, $50 was negligible. This economics determined who the medium's clients were and what kind of practice she could build. The most successful mediums in the Gilded Age built practices that were indistinguishable, in their social texture, from the practices of other professional service providers who served the wealthy. They had waiting lists, they had referral networks, they had long-term client relationships that involved regular consultation over periods of months or years. They were known, within the social circles they served, by reputation and by recommendation, and the recommendation of a satisfied client was worth considerably more to their practices than any form of public advertisement. The best of them were also by necessity deeply knowledgeable about the social world in which they operated. They knew who was related to whom, who had died recently, which estates were in dispute, which families were experiencing the specific kinds of stress that made their clients' needs both urgent and complex. This knowledge was not supernatural. It was the product of years of close observation of the world in which they worked. A medium who'd been serving Manhattan's upper class for 20 years in 1895 knew the genealogies of the major families the way a physician knew their medical histories, thoroughly, with an attention to the specific details that shaped the present situation. She knew who had quarrelled with whom, and over what. She knew which sons had borrowed money and not repaid it, and which daughters had married against their parents' wishes, and which brothers had been expected to inherit something that had been unexpectedly diverted. She knew the texture of the relationships that the living had with the dead, because she had been present, over years, for the accumulation of those relationships and their interruption by death. This knowledge was, in the context of a séance, extraordinarily useful. It allowed the medium to speak with a specificity that seemed miraculous to the uninitiated, but was, to anyone who understood how the practice worked, the product of accumulated social intelligence combined with genuine attention to what the client was communicating through her manner and her questions and the things she was careful not to say. The medium who served the Gilded Age wealthy was, among other things, a repository of social knowledge. She held in her memory and in whatever record she kept the accumulated history of the families she served, a history that was not available anywhere else, not in the newspapers, not in the social registers, not in the legal documents. She held it the way a doctor holds a family's medical history, or a lawyer holds a family's legal history, as a resource that could be drawn on in specific situations and that represented, in its specificity and its privacy, a form of power. This power was not unlimited. The medium operated under significant constraints. She was a woman, which meant that the social and legal structures of the time gave her limited standing. She was often of lower social origin than her clients, which meant that the world of those clients could be withdrawn from her as easily as it had been extended. She was, in her practice, operating in territory that was publicly contested, that the newspapers mocked and the scientific community challenged and the legal system regarded with increasing suspicion. But within these constraints, within the drawing rooms where the gas lamps were turned low and the circle was formed, and the attention of everyone present was focused on the question of what the dead were saying, the medium had something that no one else in the room possessed, the authority that comes from being the designated channel between two worlds. That authority was real. It was constructed and maintained through skill and practice, and the management of expectations, but it was real. And the women who hired mediums understood intuitively that they were not simply paying for a performance. They were paying for access to a form of authority that was otherwise unavailable to them. This was the transaction at the heart of the Gilded Age séance, and it was, in its way, one of the more interesting economic arrangements of the period. The geography of Gilded Age spiritualism was not accidental. The practices clustered in certain cities, in certain neighborhoods, in certain kinds of buildings, because the conditions that made them possible were concentrated in those places. New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, the great cities of the industrial age where new wealth was being created and old wealth was being contested, and the social structures that governed the distribution of that wealth were simultaneously rigid and under pressure. Within these cities, the practices clustered in the middle-class and upper-class residential neighborhoods, not in the poorest districts, where the economics did not support a paid medium's practice, and not in the grandest official spaces, which were too public for the kind of private consultation the séance required. They clustered in the brownstones and the row houses and the smaller townhouses, in the neighborhoods where professional women could operate with a degree of privacy and where their clients could visit without attracting undue notice. The parlour was the natural home of the séance because the parlour was the natural home of women's authority in the domestic architecture of the time. The parlour was where the woman of the house received her guests, managed her social obligations, conducted the daily business of maintaining the household's position in the world. It was a room designed for the exercise of a specifically domestic form of power, and the séance fit naturally into its geography. The drawing rooms where the most significant séances were held, the séances that touched directly on the management of large estates and the redirection of substantial fortunes, were not anonymous spaces. They were specific rooms in specific houses belonging to specific women whose social positions were well established and whose use of the room for the purposes of spirit consultation was known, within their circles, to the people who needed to know it. The discretion was real, but it was not absolute. The medium's visits were not secret exactly. They were simply not discussed in the settings where discussion would have been awkward, in the presence of the lawyers and trustees whose authority was being implicitly challenged, in the presence of the family members whose expectations were being managed, in the public social settings where the woman's respectable reputation needed to be maintained, without the complication of association with something that was, by the 1890s, beginning to carry a slight social taint. Within the circles of women who shared this practice, however, the knowledge was common. Women talked to each other about the mediums they had found valuable. They made introductions. They attended each other's séances as witnesses. They shared the intelligence that the medium had provided and evaluated together whether it was accurate, whether it was useful, how it might be deployed in the specific situation at hand. This network of women who shared the practice and shared the intelligence was, in itself, a form of power. It was an information network that operated below the level of the official social structures, below the level of the clubs and the bars and the business associations where men organized their knowledge of the world and of each other. It was a network organized around grief and spirituality and the management of inherited wealth, and it was, within its domain, remarkably effective. The geography of the séance was thus not merely the geography of a room or a neighborhood. It was the geography of a social network, of relationships between women who were navigating similar situations with similar tools, sharing intelligence and support and the specific knowledge of which mediums were worth consulting and what to expect from them. This network persisted, in various forms, for decades. It was informal and unacknowledged and left almost no direct documentary trace. But it was real, and it was one of the mechanisms through which the strategies of Gilded Age spiritualism were developed and refined and passed from generation to generation of women who needed them. After the settlement in the Houghton estate was concluded and the papers were signed and the lawyers had sent their final bills and the matter was officially resolved, Constance Houghton did something that she had not allowed herself to do during the months of negotiation. She went to Madame Rosalie for a session that had nothing to do with strategy. She sat in the small back room on West 23rd Street and she asked Madame Rosalie to see if George would come through. Not with messages about the estate, not with guidance about the settlement. Simply to speak, if he could, the way he had spoken before he was ill, in the ordinary register of a man talking to his wife. What she received, or what she understood herself to receive, was not dramatically different from what the strategic sessions had produced. But the quality of it was different, in the way that a conversation has a different quality, depending on what it is for. The earlier sessions had been purposeful and directed. This one was not. This one was simply two people in a room, or two people and the memory of a third sitting together without agenda. She wept through most of it, not from grief exactly, or not only from grief, from the relief of having somewhere to put all the things she had been holding for the months of the dispute, all the exhaustion and the anger and the doubt about whether she had done the right thing, and the uncertainty about what she actually believed about any of it. She sat there and she wept, and the medium spoke quietly, and whether George was there or not, the room held her. This is perhaps the most important thing the séance could do, and the thing it is hardest to account for in any framework that focuses only on strategy. It held the grief. It gave it a container, a context, a language. It said, "This is a place where loss is acknowledged, where the dead are treated as still present, where the conversation that death interrupted does not have to be permanently over." For women who had spent months managing the legal and financial consequences of losing someone, who had been required to be practical and decisive and strategic about an experience that was also, underneath all the practicality, a catastrophic loss. For these women, the room where the medium worked was one of the few rooms where the loss itself was the subject, where the grief was not something to be overcome or managed, but something to be inhabited. Constance Houghton left the session on West 23rd Street lighter than she had been when she arrived. She walked up the street in the September afternoon, and she thought about the 22 years of the marriage and the specific qualities of the man she had married, his impatience and his humour and his occasional surprising gentleness, and she thought, whatever else was true, he was real, and I knew him, and he is gone now. She thought, I will not let the legal structures of his death be the only thing that remains of him. She walked home. She had dinner alone, as she had been having most of her dinners for the past year. She sat afterward in the drawing room with a book she was not quite reading. The gas lamps turned low, the window open to the September street. She thought about what came next. What came next was the management of the estate, which she undertook with the competence and thoroughness that she had brought to everything else in the marriage. She made decisions, she hired advisors. She grew the railroad bond portfolio with a degree of investment intelligence that surprised the men who worked with her. Men who had expected, perhaps, a widow managing conservatively and cautiously, and found instead a woman who had spent 22 years paying attention to her husband's business, and who had, as a result, arrived at her own views about where the best opportunities were and what the risks worth taking looked like. She was not a famous investor. She was not known outside the circles of her own affairs, but she was effective, and the estate she left to her daughter was larger than the estate she had received, and the structure she created for its management gave her daughter more direct authority than she herself had possessed. This was the inheritance she valued most, not the money exactly, though the money mattered, the approach, the understanding that the visible world of legal documents and investment portfolios and estate management was navigable, that the tools for navigating it could be learned, that the intelligence required was not something only men possessed. She had learned this in the drawing room on West 23rd Street, among other places. She had learned it in the negotiation with Cordelia and the lawyers, in the months when she had been required to hold the strategic and the consolatory in the same hands without letting either drop. She had learned it the way women of her era learned the most important things, not in schools or offices, not from the people who officially had authority, but in the margins of the world as it was officially organised, in the rooms where women talked to each other about the actual texture of their lives. The medium's room had been one of those rooms. It was not the only one, and it was not the most important one, but it had been real. Constance Houghton thought about this sometimes in the years that followed. She thought about the strange combination of calculation and grief that had brought her to that room on West 23rd Street, and about what she had found there. The tool, yes, but also the space. The conversation, yes, but also the permission to have it. She was, in the end, grateful for both. The Whitmore case, as we have examined it, centres on the adults: Eugenia Whitmore Draper, the medium Sarah Prentice, the challenging brothers Robert and Clarence. But there were also children in these houses, and the experience of growing up in a household where the medium visited regularly left its traces in ways that the historical record only partially captures. Robert Whitmore's daughter, a girl of 12 when the estate dispute was settled, grew up in a household that was shaped by the experience of having encountered spiritualism in its most explicitly strategic form, as a weapon deployed against her father's claims. She grew up hearing her father's account of the situation, which was, as one might expect, not particularly favourable to the medium or to spiritualism in general. She heard the investigator's report discussed at the dinner table. She absorbed, from her father's manner and from the social world around her, the increasingly sceptical attitude toward spiritualism that the scientific investigations of the period were producing. And yet she did not fully share her father's hostility. She had also, as a child, been present at the edges of the séances that had been held at the Whitmore estate, not as a participant, but as a child who hides in hallways and listens through doors, the way children always have. She had heard Sarah Prentice speak. She had heard the voice that the medium produced for her grandmother's spirit, the voice of a woman who had died years before the girl's birth and whom she knew only from portraits and from the stories of the people who had loved her. The voice had sounded from outside the door like someone who actually missed the people in the room. This impression, partial, overheard, obtained through the distorted medium of a closed door and a child's incomplete understanding, stayed with her, not as a belief exactly, as a question. The kind of question that does not resolve itself cleanly but continues to sit in the back of the mind, available to be revisited when the circumstances of one's adult life make it relevant. When Robert Whitmore died in 1909, his daughter found herself in the familiar position of having to navigate the distribution of an estate whose terms she found inadequate. The terms of her father's will gave the bulk of the estate to her brother, with a modest provision for herself and her children. It was not as unfair as the arrangements that had originally confronted Eugenia. It was not a deliberate exclusion, but simply the default tendency of men of that era and class to prioritize the male line in distribution. She did not hire a medium, but she thought about it. She thought about the séances she'd overheard as a child, about the voice of her dead grandmother speaking through Sarah Prentice, about the strategic intelligence with which Eugenia Whitmore Draper had deployed that voice in the service of her own claims. She thought about what that strategy had required: the belief, the preparation, the network of willing witnesses, the willingness to introduce into a legal dispute something that could not be easily countered on its own terms. She thought about all of this, and then she did something that reflects the changed circumstances of 1909 compared to 1891. She engaged a lawyer who specialized in a new field, the rights of women under trust law, a field that had been developing over the previous 2 decades as women's legal advocacy organizations had pushed, with increasing success, for changes to the structures that had so effectively limited women's claims on their own inheritances. She won a modest adjustment to the trust terms through this legal challenge, not as large a victory as Eugenia's perhaps, but secured through means that required neither medium nor séance, and that could not be challenged on grounds of undue influence or supernatural manipulation. The world had changed, the tools available had changed. The underlying need, the need to claim what one was owed in a world organized to distribute wealth primarily to men, had not. This is the continuity that runs through all these stories, from 1865 to 1915 and beyond. The same need, addressed with the tools that the specific moment made available, by women who understood that the tools were instruments in the service of a claim that was legitimate regardless of which instrument was used to press it. The medium was one instrument, the law was another, the social network was a third, the patient management of expectations over decades was a fourth. Different women used different instruments, or the same women used different instruments at different moments in their lives. What remained constant was the claim itself. What remained constant was the understanding, sometimes conscious, sometimes not, sometimes strategic, sometimes simply felt, that the distribution of wealth in the world they lived in was not natural, not inevitable, not the expression of a just ordering of things. It was the product of specific legal and social arrangements that had been constructed by people, and that could therefore be contested and renegotiated by people, including by the women who'd been most disadvantaged by those arrangements. The medium knew this, even if she did not always say it in these terms. The women who hired her knew this, even when they expressed it in the language of grief and love and the desire to hear a dead voice one more time. The voice from the other side was, among other things, the voice of this knowledge, the knowledge that the official arrangements were not the final word, that the dead, if they could speak, would say something different, that the women who were left behind to manage the consequences of those arrangements had not been adequately accounted for in the documents that the living men had left behind. This was what the medium said, séance after séance, in drawing room after drawing room, in the houses where the gas lamps burned low and the circle was formed, and the voice came through the stillness like something that had been waiting for a very long time to be heard. In the spring of 1884, a woman named Constance Houghton arrived at the office of a medium called Madame Rosalie on West 23rd Street in Manhattan, and the arrangement she proposed was unlike anything the medium had previously been asked to undertake. Constance Houghton was 53 years old, the widow of a textile manufacturer named George Houghton, who had died the previous autumn after a brief illness. George Houghton's estate was valued at approximately $3.5 million, consisting primarily of mills in New England and a portfolio of railroad bonds that had appreciated considerably since their purchase. The will he had left, drawn up 7 years before his death, divided the estate between his wife Constance and his daughter from his first marriage, a woman named Cordelia. Cordelia Houghton was 31 years old, the daughter of George's first wife, who died in childbirth 20 years earlier. She had been raised largely by relatives in Ohio while George remarried and built his business, and she had appeared in his life with irregular frequency, occasional visits, occasional letters, occasional reminders that she existed and that he had obligations toward her. She was not hostile toward Constance, particularly. There was simply a distance between them that had never been bridged, a gap of history and affection that the will had attempted to address by giving Cordelia roughly 40% of the estate. Constance did not feel that 40% reflected the relative merits of their claims. She had managed the household for 22 years. She had managed George's social life, his correspondence, his relationships with business partners and civic institutions. She had given him the stability and the domestic order that allowed him to concentrate on his business, and she had, she believed, been instrumental in many of the financial decisions that had grown his fortune from a modest manufacturing concern to the substantial operation it had become at his death. Cordelia had done none of these things. Cordelia had lived her life in Ohio, visiting occasionally, making polite conversation over dinner, and collecting the allowance that George had settled on her at the time of Constance's arrival in his life. These were facts, and Constance was not without legal resources to press them. But the will was clear, and the courts were unlikely to override it without compelling evidence that its terms were contrary to George's true intentions. This was the point at which she came to Madame Rosalie. What Constance Houghton wanted was a message from George, a message establishing as clearly as possible that he wished his estate to be distributed differently than the will provided. She wanted this message to be received during a séance, preferably with witnesses of sufficient standing that their testimony would carry weight. She wanted it recorded in writing, and she wanted it conveyed to Cordelia's lawyers in a manner that would make it difficult for them to ignore. Madame Rosalie was a small, dark woman from Louisiana who had come to New York in the 1870s and established a reputation as one of the more reliable mediums in the city. Reliable meaning that her clients tended to receive the communications they needed rather than merely the communications that happened to arrive. She was not, by her own account, a fraud in the simple sense of someone who fabricated every message. She believed genuinely in the reality of spirit communication, but she also believed in the practical necessity of helping the spirits articulate themselves clearly, particularly when the questions at stake were complex legal ones that might confuse the recently dead. She agreed to work with Constance Houghton. The séances that followed over the next 6 months were remarkable for their organisation and their consistency. George Houghton's spirit appeared at session after session, expressing the same general themes with the clarity and coherence of a man who had had time to reflect on his earthly affairs from the vantage point of eternity. He spoke of his gratitude to Constance. He spoke of his recognition that the will, as written, did not fully reflect his intentions. He spoke of Cordelia with affection but without urgency. She would be provided for, he indicated, but not in the proportion the current document suggested. These communications were recorded by a secretary who attended the séances at Constance's request. They were witnessed by 3 women of good social standing who had been introduced to the process gradually, beginning as curious observers and ending as genuine believers in the authenticity of what they were witnessing, and they were eventually presented through an attorney who specialized in the intersection of estate law and spiritualist claims to the lawyers managing the Houghton estate. The lawyers managing the estate were not convinced. They had seen this before. The deployment of spirit messages in inheritance disputes was not new, and the legal system's response to such messages had been, by and large, consistent. They were not admissible as evidence of testamentary intent. A will was a legal document, executed according to specific requirements, and it could not be modified after death by communications received through a medium. This was not a matter of skepticism about spiritualism per se. It was a matter of the mechanics of estate law. But Constance Houghton had not expected the messages to win the case in court. That was not their purpose. Their purpose was to move Cordelia. Cordelia Houghton had grown up in a household that took spiritualism seriously. Her grandmother in Ohio had been a committed spiritualist who had attended séances regularly and who had spoken often of the communications she had received from her own dead husband. Cordelia did not dismiss the possibility of spirit communication. She was, in fact, rather susceptible to it. When the record of the séances was presented to her, not in a legal context but in a personal one, presented by Constance herself in a meeting at which Madame Rosalie was also present, Cordelia wept. She sat in Constance's drawing room and listened to the transcriptions of her father's voice, and whatever scepticism she might have brought to the meeting dissolved in the face of details that only her father could have known, his pet names for her, the memory of a particular summer visit when she was 12, the regret he expressed for the years of distance. Whether these details had been researched by Constance or genuinely transmitted by George Houghton's spirit, Cordelia could not be certain, but the uncertainty itself was enough to move her toward conciliation. She agreed to a renegotiation. The final settlement, reached without litigation, gave Constance 60% of the estate and Cordelia 40%, the same proportion as the original will, but with a crucial difference in structure. Constance received the liquid assets and the railroad bonds outright, which she could manage and invest as she chose. Cordelia received a share of the mill properties in a trust structure that gave the trustees appointed largely through Constance's recommendation, considerable discretion over distributions. It was not the complete victory that Constance had sought, but it was substantially better than the original will, and it had been achieved without the expense and exposure of litigation. Madame Rosalie received a fee that was never publicly disclosed. The story of Constance Houghton is not unique. It is representative of a pattern that repeated itself in the great houses of the Gilded Age, with a frequency that the historical record only partially captures, because the cases that were settled quietly, settled over tea, or in drawing rooms, or in the offices of lawyers who understood that the introduction of spirit evidence had changed the negotiating dynamics in ways that could not be easily overcome, left no court records. We know about the cases that went to trial. We know about the spectacular frauds that were exposed and the mediums who ended up in prison. What we know less well is the enormous middle ground of cases that were settled, that were renegotiated, that were quietly resolved in a direction that benefited the woman who had hired the medium, because the alternative, a trial in which spirit messages would be introduced and witnesses would testify, and the newspapers would cover the proceedings with the gleeful intensity they reserve for anything touching on money and the supernatural, was worse than whatever compromise could be arranged. The medium's real power was not in the courtroom, it was in the threat of the courtroom. It was in the calculation made by lawyers and heirs and trustees that fighting a spirit message publicly was a more expensive proposition than accommodating it quietly. Constance Houghton lived until 1901. She managed her portion of the estate with a competence that had been invisible during her husband's lifetime, but became apparent in the years after it, growing the railroad bond portfolio considerably and making several charitable bequests that were noted in the newspapers with approval. She never consulted a medium again, or at least not professionally. Whether she believed in the authenticity of George's messages to the end of her life, or whether they had been from the beginning a calculated performance, is a question that cannot be answered now. Madame Rosalie continued to practice on West 23rd Street for another 12 years, serving a clientele that included several of New York's most prominent families. She died in 1896, leaving an estate of approximately $40,000, a comfortable sum for a woman who had arrived in New York with almost nothing. Her papers, if she kept any, have never been found. The case of the Whitmore will is perhaps the most extensively documented example of spiritualism deployed in an inheritance dispute in the Gilded Age, and it is also, for reasons that will become clear, the most instructive. Walter Whitmore died in October of 1891 at his estate outside Philadelphia, leaving a fortune estimated at $4 million and a will that had been prepared by his lawyers 3 months before his death, and that departed dramatically from the distribution most observers had expected. The will gave the bulk of the estate, roughly $3 million in railroad stocks, real estate, and liquid assets, to Walter's niece, a woman named Eugenia Whitmore Draper, who had managed his household for the last 6 years of his life after the death of his wife. The remaining $1 million was divided among Walter's 3 adult children from his first marriage, 2 sons and a daughter, who had expected, based on conversations with their father and on an earlier will of which several witnesses had knowledge, to receive the majority of the estate. The sons, Robert and Clarence Whitmore, engaged a prominent Philadelphia law firm immediately after the will was read, and initiated a challenge based on several grounds: undue influence, lack of testamentary capacity, and the claim that Walter had been manipulated by Eugenia during the years of her management of his household. Eugenia Whitmore Draper was a formidable woman. She was 44 years old, a widow with 2 grown children of her own, who had taken charge of Walter's household with an efficiency and thoroughness that had visibly improved both his physical health and his social life during the years she managed it. She had also, during these years, developed a deep and serious commitment to spiritualism. Whether she had come to spiritualism through genuine conviction or through an appreciation of its practical possibilities is impossible to determine with certainty. What is clear from the historical record is that during the 3 years before Walter's death, séances had been held at the Whitmore estate on a regular basis, and that Walter himself had attended many of them. The medium was a woman from Boston named Sarah Prentice, no relation to the Eliza Prentice who had appeared in the Hetty Green case, though the coincidence of surname has confused several historical accounts. Sarah Prentice was well regarded in the spiritualist community as a trance medium who specialized in long discursive communications from the recently dead, communications that dealt not with general consolation, but with specific questions of earthly business, questions about investments and properties and the disposition of estates. She was, by any fair assessment, extraordinarily good at her work. In the months before Walter's death, the séances at the Whitmore estate had produced a series of communications from Walter's dead wife, Helen, who had died in 1885 and who, according to Sarah Prentice, was keenly interested in the disposition of her husband's estate. Helen spoke in these communications of her great affection for Eugenia, of her gratitude for the care Eugenia had given Walter, of her wish that Eugenia should be rewarded appropriately. She spoke less warmly of Robert and Clarence, who had, she indicated, been attentive to their father, primarily during periods when they needed financial assistance. These were not, it must be noted, entirely false characterizations. Robert Whitmore had indeed borrowed twice from his father and had been slow to repay. Clarence had been estranged from Walter for several years over a business dispute that had ended badly. Whether Helen Whitmore's spirit had genuinely communicated these assessments, or whether Sarah Prentice had obtained them from Eugenia, who had obtained them from Walter, or from some combination of research and informed guessing, is the question that the court proceedings of 1892 never quite resolved. Robert and Clarence Whitmore's legal team hired 2 investigators to look into Sarah Prentice's methods. The investigators produced a report concluding that she was almost certainly a fraud, that the specific details she cited in her communications were consistent with information that could have been obtained through research and through Eugenia's intimate knowledge of the Whitmore family's history. The report was detailed and methodologically serious. It was also legally almost useless. The investigators' report established that the information Sarah Prentice possessed could have been obtained through mundane means. It did not establish that it had been, and in the court of public opinion, as opposed to the court of law, the distinction mattered enormously. Sarah Prentice gave testimony that was composed and credible. She spoke of her own belief in the reality of spirit communication. She described the séances at the Whitmore estate with the matter-of-fact precision of a professional doing her job. She was not defensive. She did not appear fraudulent. Eugenia Whitmore Draper's legal team made the most of the situation. They argued that the challenge to the will was motivated by simple greed, that Robert and Clarence Whitmore had received substantial assistance from their father during his lifetime, that Eugenia had provided services that were worth considerably more than her compensation, and that Walter Whitmore had been fully competent at the time he executed the will. They also, more quietly, made it known that if the case proceeded to full trial, Eugenia intended to enter into evidence the complete transcripts of the séances held at the Whitmore estate, every communication attributed to Helen Whitmore, every message that concerned the disposition of the estate, every session at which Walter had been present and had indicated his agreement with the sentiments being expressed. The prospect of this material entering the public record was enough. Robert and Clarence Whitmore settled. The terms of the settlement gave each of them a somewhat increased share of the estate, enough to make the compromise acceptable, and left Eugenia with the bulk of what the will had provided. Sarah Prentice was not mentioned in the settlement documents. The episode became, in legal circles in Philadelphia and New York, one of those cautionary cases that lawyers cited when advising clients about the dangers of allowing a household to be managed by someone with spiritualist connections. But it was also, in the same circles, a case that illustrated the genuine effectiveness of the strategy. Eugenia Whitmore Draper had not fabricated a will. She had not forged a signature. She had simply arranged for the dead to speak, clearly and at length, about their wishes, and the living had ultimately accommodated those wishes. The lesson was not lost on the women of the Gilded Age who were paying attention. Not all the stories of Gilded Age women and their management of inherited wealth involved mediums. Some of them involved something stranger, and in some ways more impressive, the decision to become, in effect, invisible. Ida Wood was born Ellen Walsh in Ireland in 1838, the daughter of a farmer in County Cork who emigrated to America when she was a child. The family arrived in Boston with almost nothing. Ellen Walsh grew up in the tenements of the North End, working from an early age, learning the American alphabet of survival, what to say, what not to say, how to present yourself in a room where the people with power are watching. By the time she was 20, she had transformed herself into Ida Mayfield, a young woman from Louisiana with a family history that could not easily be verified, and a beauty that required no verification at all. She was small, dark-haired, with an intelligence that showed in her eyes even when she was performing the role of decorative femininity that the times required. She married Benjamin Wood in 1867. Benjamin Wood was a congressman and newspaper publisher who owned the New York Daily News, and who was, at various points in his career, one of the most controversial figures in American public life, accused, among other things, of Confederate sympathies during the war and of financial manipulations that would have been criminal if the laws had been written differently. He was also extremely wealthy. Ida Wood managed her marriage with the same intelligence she had applied to the management of her own identity. She was charming without being forthcoming. She was present at the social gatherings her husband's position required, but she controlled, carefully, what people knew about her. The story of the Irish immigrant from the North End of Boston was buried under the story of the Louisiana heiress, and the burial was thorough enough to last for decades. When Benjamin Wood died in 1900, he left an estate of approximately $1.5 million. Ida received her share under the will, managed it with the financial intelligence that had always been her most reliable attribute, and then, in 1907, did something extraordinary. She disappeared. Not literally. She did not leave New York. She simply withdrew with her sister Mary into a suite of rooms at the Herald Square Hotel and refused to come out. For 24 years, Ida Wood and her sister lived in those rooms, rarely leaving, rarely admitting visitors, their needs managed by a rotation of hotel staff who slipped meals under the door or passed them through a narrow opening. The rooms accumulated decades of newspapers and correspondence, and the accumulated detritus of two elderly women who had decided, for reasons they never fully explained, to withdraw from the world. There is no spiritualist element to Ida Wood's story. There is no medium, no séance, no spirit message. What there is instead is a woman who had built her entire life on the management of appearances, and who, at a certain point, decided that the performances were no longer worth the effort. She was, in her disappearance, protecting something. The exact contours of what she was protecting only became clear in 1931, when she died and the hotel rooms were opened and the contents were examined. She had been protecting money, a great deal of money, in cash and securities, hidden in the walls and under the mattresses and in the boxes stacked in the closets of those accumulated rooms. She had, during her years of apparent poverty and seclusion, preserved a fortune that her relatives had assumed was gone. The legal proceedings that followed her death were long and complex, involving claimants who came forward from every direction, many of them asserting family connections that had not previously been mentioned. The question of her true identity, the Irish immigrant Ellen Walsh, or the Louisiana heiress Ida Mayfield, was relitigated in the probate courts. The confusion she had cultivated throughout her life served, in death, to protect what she had accumulated. Sorting out the legitimate claims from the spurious ones took years. Ida Wood's story does not fit neatly into the narrative of spiritualism and inheritance that runs through this history, but it belongs here because it illustrates the broader point. The women of the Gilded Age who found themselves in control of significant wealth, whether inherited, accumulated, or managed through decades of careful performance, were not passive. They were strategic. They used whatever tools were available to them: mediums, lawyers, silence, performance, the cultivation of confusion. The medium was one tool among several, but it was a particularly powerful tool because it introduced into the calculation something that no ordinary legal strategy could introduce: the voice of the dead. And the voice of the dead in a culture that took that voice seriously was very hard to argue with. The story of Harriet Jones, called Hetty by everyone who knew her, which distinguished her conveniently from the more famous Hetty Green, begins with a marriage and ends with a courtroom, and the medium appears somewhere in the middle, at precisely the moment when the legal tools available to Hetty had run out. Hetty Jones married Thomas Clarence Jones in 1878, in a ceremony in Brooklyn that her family attended with mixed feelings. Thomas was a shipping merchant, prosperous and sociable, with a gift for making connections and a tendency toward large gestures, gifts of jewellery, unexpected trips, weekend parties at houses borrowed from business friends. He was charming in the way of certain men who have found that charm reliably smooths the friction of daily life. He was not, Hetty's mother had noted privately, the kind of man whose fortune would outlast his death. Her mother was wrong about this. Thomas Jones was more careful than he appeared. The shipping business he ran was small but stable, and during the 30 years of their marriage he had managed it with sufficient prudence that by the time he died, in 1908, the estate was worth something in the neighbourhood of $800,000. Not a Vanderbilt fortune, not a Whitmore estate, but a comfortable sum that should have provided adequately for Hetty and for the couple's 2 surviving children. The problem was Thomas's brother. Edward Jones had been involved in the shipping business as a junior partner for much of its history. He was younger than Thomas by 8 years, had never married, and had worked alongside his brother with a dedication that Thomas had valued and rewarded over the years with a series of agreements, loans and arrangements that had never been fully formalised, but which Edward believed constituted a claim on roughly half the business's assets. The will, as executed by Thomas a year before his death, did not acknowledge these claims. It left the estate to Hetty and the children, with modest bequests to several charities. Edward Jones was not mentioned. Edward filed a challenge almost immediately, citing the alleged oral agreements and the loans he claimed to have made to the business during periods of financial difficulty. He engaged a lawyer who was skilled at the kind of estate litigation that turned on the interpretation of conversations and informal understandings rather than written contracts. Hetty's own lawyer was less hopeful than she needed him to be. The challenge would probably not succeed, he told her, but it would be expensive and prolonged, and the settlement that Edward might accept before trial was not negligible. Perhaps $75,000, perhaps more. The alternative was several years of litigation, with all the attendant costs and the possibility, however remote, that a sympathetic judge or jury might view Edward's claims more generously than the written record suggested they deserved. It was during the weeks of this assessment, while Hetty sat with her lawyer in an office in Lower Manhattan and listened to the careful accounting of what was possible and what was not, that she first thought of the medium. She had attended séances before, twice, in the company of a friend who was deeply committed to spiritualism, and who had urged Hetty for years to open herself to the possibility of communication with the dead. She had not been particularly moved by either experience. The communications she had received were vague and could have applied to almost anyone. The medium had seemed sincere enough, but not impressive. The medium she found for this purpose was different. Her name was Arabella Farn, and she came with references from 3 women in Hetty's social circle, who spoke of her with the kind of careful, measured enthusiasm that suggested they had reason to be grateful. She was a Quaker from Philadelphia, 50 years old, with the stillness and authority of someone who had spent decades learning to trust the communication she received. She did not advertise. She did not solicit clients. She was retained through introductions, and the women who introduced her tended to speak of her with a loyalty that went beyond the merely satisfied. Arabella Farn met with Hetty 3 times before they attempted the séance. She asked questions about Thomas, about his life, his business, his relationships, his character. She listened with an attention that felt different from the social listening Hetty was accustomed to, a deeper focus that seemed to be reaching past the words for something underneath them. When the séance finally occurred, it was in the late afternoon of a November day in 1909, in Hetty's sitting room on Prospect Park West in Brooklyn, with 2 witnesses present, both friends of Hetty's, both sympathetic to what was being attempted. Thomas Jones came through clearly. He spoke of his business with the fluency of a man who had spent 30 years thinking about it. He named figures. He mentioned specific transactions. He expressed, with what seemed like genuine irritation, the view that his brother Edward's claims were not legitimate, that the loans Edward had made to the business had been repaid, that the oral agreements Edward cited had been superseded by written arrangements that Edward was conveniently misremembering, and that his intention, had he lived to deal with the situation himself, would have been to resist Edward's claims completely. He also expressed something that was not in the legal record and could not have been obtained through research, a memory of a conversation with Hetty on a Sunday morning in the garden, in which he had told her that the business was hers and the children's and that he trusted her to manage it. The garden was specific, the Sunday morning was specific. The words he had used were specific enough that Hetty, who was attempting to maintain the composure appropriate to a witness, wept. The record of the séance was transcribed and presented to Edward Jones's lawyer, not as legal evidence. Hetty's own lawyer had advised against attempting to introduce it in court, but as part of a negotiation, Hetty wanted Edward's lawyer to understand that his client's claims would be contested by witnesses who would testify to the contents of the séance, and that the trial, if there was one, would include testimony that would make Edward look not merely grasping, but actively disrespectful of his dead brother's expressed wishes. Edward Jones's lawyer was a practical man. He understood the calculation. A trial in which spirit messages were introduced was unpredictable in ways that a straightforward dispute over written contracts was not. Juries contained people who believed in spiritualism and people who found it offensive, and there was no way to know in advance which way they would lean. The reputational cost of being portrayed as the man who was overriding the wishes of his dead brother, as expressed through a medium of apparent integrity with multiple witnesses, was not trivial. Edward accepted a settlement of $45,000, considerably less than he had initially demanded, and less than Hetty's own lawyer had estimated he might accept. Hetty Jones managed the rest of the estate for the remainder of her life with considerable competence, increasing its value modestly through careful investment and avoiding the spectacular reverses that ruined so many Gilded Age fortunes. She consulted Arabella Farn once more, 2 years after the settlement, but the consultation was personal rather than strategic. She wanted, she said, to talk to Thomas again. She wanted to ask him something that she had not been able to ask while he was alive. Whatever the answer was, she kept it to herself. She died in 1928, leaving her children an estate that had grown to roughly $1 million. Arabella Farn continued her practice until her death in 1919. She was never publicly accused of fraud. She was never investigated or prosecuted. She left no memoir and gave no interviews. She exists in the historical record primarily through the testimony of the women who retained her services, and that testimony is uniformly, if cautiously, favourable. There is a particular irony in the fact that the family most associated with the rigid maintenance of social exclusion in the Gilded Age, the family whose matriarch had made herself the arbiter of who belonged and who did not, was also a family with a complicated relationship to the world of spirit communication. The Astors did not consult mediums in drawing rooms, or at least not openly, or at least not in ways that left documentary traces that historians have been able to follow. What they did was something more subtle. They created, through the machinery of their social dominance, a culture in which the idea of consulting a medium was associated with either the desperately credulous or the desperately strategic, which meant that any Asta-adjacent woman who wished to explore spiritualism had to do so with considerable discretion. But discretion is not the same as absence. Mrs. Carolyn Asta, who presided over the upper reaches of New York society for 3 decades, with the absolute authority of someone who had never been seriously challenged, died in 1908 at the age of 78. She had been declining for several years before her death, suffering from memory loss and confusion that those around her attributed publicly to age and privately to dementia. During these years, the management of her affairs had passed, formally and informally, to a circle of advisors and family members whose various interests did not always coincide. The question of what Mrs. Asta actually wanted, and what she would have wanted had she been capable of expressing her wishes clearly, was one that various parties had reason to ask and different answers to offer. We are not here to claim that a medium was consulted in the management of the Asta succession. There is no clear evidence that one was. What the Asta situation illustrates is something more diffuse but equally important: the degree to which the management of a declining matriarch's preferences could become a site of contest among the people around her, and the degree to which any tool that helped establish what she would have wanted, any testimony, any document, any communication that could be attributed to her genuine wishes, had value in that contest. The women who orbited Mrs. Asta's world in her final years understood this perfectly. They had spent their lives in a social environment where the distinction between genuine authority and performed authority was barely visible, where what Mrs. Asta was known to have said mattered enormously, and what she might be persuaded to have implied could matter almost as much. One such woman was a figure known in the historical record only as Mrs. Orme, a widow of some means who had been part of Mrs. Asta's social circle for 20 years, and who, in the early 1900s, developed a deep interest in spiritualism that she practiced quietly and without advertisement. Mrs. Orme's story reaches us through a series of letters written by her niece, a young woman named Frances who spent several seasons in New York during the first decade of the century, and who had a talent for observation that her correspondence amply demonstrates. In these letters, Frances describes attending several séances at her aunt's house, at which Mrs. Orme served as the focal point, not as a medium herself, but as the primary recipient of communications that were delivered by a medium employed for the purpose. The communications included, on several occasions, messages from Mrs. Asta's late husband, William Backhouse Asta Jr., who had died in 1892. These messages were, by Frances's account, remarkably specific about matters of society and social standing, about which families merited inclusion in the most exclusive gatherings, about which recent arrivals from the world of new money had demonstrated sufficient quality to deserve consideration, about which long-established social arrangements ought to be reconsidered. The dead William Backhouse Asta Jr. had apparently views that were considerably more progressive than those of his living wife. Whether Mrs. Orme shared these communications with anyone who had the standing to act on them is not clear from Frances's letters. Whether the medium was generating these opinions from Mrs. Orme's own inclinations or from some other source is equally unclear. What is clear is that Mrs. Orme found in the séance a space where the social order that had excluded or constrained various people she cared about could be imaginatively revised, where the dead patriarch of the family that had defined New York society for 3 decades could be made to say, through the voice of a medium, things that the living matriarch had never said and might never say. This is a different kind of strategy than the ones we've been examining. This is not about redirecting an inheritance or winning a settlement. This is about something more intimate and in some ways more telling, the use of spirit communication to imagine, if only in the privacy of a darkened room, a world organized differently than the one outside the window. Mrs. Orme's story is not a success story in any conventional sense. She did not change the social order of New York. She didn't open the doors that Mrs. Asta had kept closed. She sat in her drawing room and listened to a medium speak in the voice of a dead man whose living wife had spent 30 years deciding who belonged and who did not, and in that space she was able, perhaps, to believe for an evening that the decisions had been different. In a world where women had limited power to reshape the structures that governed their lives, there was something not trivial in the act of imagining those structures differently, even in a drawing room, even through the voice of a medium, even if only for an evening. The morning always came. The social order reasserted itself. The invitations arrived, or did not arrive, as they always had. But the evening had existed. The imagining had been real. And sometimes, in other houses, in other circumstances, the imagining had consequences. There is a story that appears in several accounts of Gilded Age spiritualism, in slightly different versions, in which a wealthy woman who had consulted mediums for years gradually realizes that the medium's most powerful tool is not the spirit message itself, but the information that surrounds it, the research, the observation, the social intelligence that allows the medium to speak with such apparent knowledge of the client's private life and private concerns. And having realized this, the woman decides that the most effective thing she can do is not hire a medium, but become one. This pattern, if it is a pattern and not simply a story that was told and retold because it contained something satisfying about the redistribution of knowledge and power, appears with enough consistency in the historical record to suggest that it happened more than once, in more than one version. The clearest version involves a woman from Boston named Margaret Stratton, who came from a family that had made its money in the textile trade, and who had, by the time she arrived in New York in the 1880s as the widow of a minor financier, both the social intelligence and the financial motivation to pursue the strategy. Margaret Stratton had spent the decade before her husband's death observing the world of New York spiritualism with the same thoroughness she had applied to everything else. She had attended séances as a client. She had observed mediums at work, noting the techniques they used and the effects they produced. She had made friends with women who were deep in the spiritualist community, learning the language and the practice from the inside, and she had arrived, through this observation, at a clear-eyed understanding of how the whole enterprise worked. The medium's power came from information, from knowledge of the client's history, gathered through research and through the attentive social listening that women of the period practiced with a fluency that was rarely named or credited, from the ability to take that information and reframe it, in the context of a séance, as communication from the dead, giving it the authority that could only come from beyond the boundary of ordinary life. Margaret Stratton began to practice on her own behalf. She was careful not to advertise herself as a medium, not initially. She occupied a social position that made open advertisement unacceptable. Mediums were tolerated and even admired in certain circles, but they were not entirely respectable, and respectability was still a resource that Margaret needed to preserve. Instead, she cultivated a reputation for what she called attunement, a heightened sensitivity to the emotional and spiritual dimensions of personal situations that was expressed not in formal séances, but in private conversations, in the advice she offered to friends who were navigating difficult family circumstances, in the quiet intermediation she provided in situations where a voice that seemed to carry unusual authority was useful. Over the course of a decade, Margaret Stratton developed a practice that operated in the borderland between friendship and professional service. She was not paid exactly, but the women she helped were grateful in ways that had practical consequences. Introductions were made, invitations were extended, information was shared, and in several cases involving inheritance disputes, cases that never reached the newspapers because they were resolved before they could, the authority that Margaret was able to bring to bear, the sense she projected of having access to knowledge that was not available through ordinary channels, was decisive in moving parties toward the outcomes that her clients needed. She was, in the terminology of the time, a confidential agent. She was also, in the terminology of a later time, a remarkably effective practitioner of the art of social intelligence, the art of knowing things and knowing how to use what you know. Whether Margaret Stratton believed in spiritualism, in the technical sense of believing that she was receiving genuine communications from the dead, is a question that she never answered directly. Her private letters, a small collection of which survives in the archive of a Boston library, are elliptical on the subject. She writes of the communication she receives with a detachment that could indicate skepticism, or could indicate the detachment of someone who has been doing this long enough that the question of whether it is real has become less interesting than the question of whether it is useful. What she clearly believed was that the information she possessed was real, and that the authority she projected was real, even if the mechanism she attributed it to was more complicated than a simple transmission from the dead. The women she helped were in genuine difficulty. The strategies she devised were effective. The outcomes, in most cases, were better for her clients than they would have been without her involvement. Whether the dead had anything to do with it was, she seemed to feel, beside the point. The medium as social strategist, the séance as negotiating tactic, the voice from the other side as the voice of a woman who had absorbed everything the visible world had to teach her and found, in the performance of access to an invisible one, a tool that the visible world could not easily neutralize. This was the most sophisticated form the strategy took, and it was, in the gilded houses of the late 19th century, the form that lasted longest and worked best. 2 years after the settlement in the Jones estate, Hetty Jones returned to Arabella Farn for the consultation she had promised herself, the one that was purely personal, with no strategic dimension, no witnesses, no transcript. She came on a November afternoon, the kind of November afternoon that New York produces with gloomy efficiency, with a low sky the colour of old pewter, and a wind that found its way through even the well-made seams of a good coat. She came by herself, by surface car, and she sat in the rocking car looking out the window at the streets and thought about what she was going to ask. She had been thinking about this for 2 years. The question she wanted to ask was one she'd not been able to ask while Thomas was alive, because asking it while he was alive would have changed something, would have required a conversation that would have altered the dynamic of the marriage in ways she could not fully predict and was not sure she wanted. The question was whether he had known about the money she kept. Not a large amount. Not a secret fortune of the kind that Ida Wood had accumulated over decades of careful concealment. A smaller thing, a bank account in her own name, under her maiden name, at a bank in Brooklyn that her husband had no connection to, into which she had deposited over the course of the marriage a modest but meaningful sum. Money set aside from the household budget here and there, $1 or $2 at a time in the early years, more in the later years as the household budget became more generous. She had done this because her mother had told her to. Her mother, who had grown up poor and had seen what happened to women who had no resources of their own when a marriage ended badly, had sat with young Hetty on the eve of her wedding and told her quietly and without drama to always have something of her own. Not much, not enough to matter if things were good, just enough to matter if things were bad. The marriage had been good. It had been genuinely good, in the ways that mattered, and the money had never been needed for the purpose it had been saved for. It had simply sat there, in the account at the bank in Brooklyn, accumulating its small interest, unmentioned and unneeded. After Thomas's death, she had transferred it to a different account under her current name and absorbed it into the estate without comment. No one had ever asked about it. It had never mattered, practically speaking. But she wanted to know whether Thomas had known, whether the 30 years of quietly maintained separate resource had been something he was aware of and had chosen not to mention, or whether it had been genuinely hidden from him, a small secret in the decades of an otherwise open marriage. She wanted to know because the answer mattered to how she understood the marriage, and the marriage was still the organising frame of her inner life, even now, even 5 years after his death. Arabella Farn received this question without visible surprise. She had, over the course of 30 years of practice, received many questions of this kind. Questions that were not about the disposition of money, but about the quality of a relationship. Questions that the living person could not have asked the dead person while they were alive. Questions that had been carried in silence through years of closeness and then been left permanently unanswered by death. She sat quietly for a moment, and then she began to speak in the particular register of her practice. Not a changed voice, not a theatrical transformation, but a quality of attention and of a knowledge that was different from ordinary conversation. Thomas had known. He had known for about 12 years, she said, had discovered it by accident when he was looking through some papers she had left on her desk, had understood immediately what it was and why she had it, and had felt, she said, not betrayal or hurt, but something closer to relief. Relief that she had been sensible enough to protect herself. Relief that the woman he had married had the intelligence and the self-preservation instinct that his own mother had lacked, to her considerable suffering. He had never mentioned it because he did not want to embarrass her, and because mentioning it would have required him to explain that he had seen her papers, which he was not supposed to have done. He had simply noted it, quietly, and added it to his understanding of the woman he was married to. An understanding that was, she said, more admiring than she probably knew. Hetty Jones sat with this for a long time after Arabella Farn finished speaking. She sat with it on the surface car going home, and she sat with it at dinner, and she sat with it in the drawing room afterward where she'd been sitting, on and off for 5 years, trying to understand what the marriage had been and what it meant that it was over. She did not know whether Arabella Farn had received a genuine communication from Thomas, or whether she had simply told Hetty what Hetty needed to hear. She had, by this point in her life, arrived at a position on this question that was comfortable enough to live with. She did not know, and she did not need to know, and the answer would not change what the information had done for her. What it had done for her was close the question. The question had been open for 32 years, since the evening before her wedding when her mother had told her to keep something for herself, through the 30 years of the marriage and the 5 years since Thomas's death. It had been open as a small background uncertainty about whether the secret had been a betrayal of the partnership or a reasonable exercise of self-preservation. Now it was closed. Whatever had produced the answer felt true. It fit what she knew of Thomas, the particular combination of pragmatism and discretion that had been among his most consistent qualities. It was the answer she would have hoped for if she had let herself hope. She let herself accept it. She never went back to Arabella Farn after that session, not because she'd stopped believing, and not because there were no more questions. There were always more questions. There always will be, for anyone who has lost someone irreplaceable. She did not go back because the thing she'd most needed to know had been addressed, and what remained was the ordinary management of grief, which she had, by then, developed considerable competence in managing on her own. Mrs. Orme and the women who moved in the outer rings of the Astor world occupied a particular social position that is worth understanding before we leave them. They were women of means, but not of the first rank. They had money, enough to maintain the kind of household the social world required, enough to dress appropriately and entertain modestly, and participate in the charitable activities that were expected of women at their level. What they did not have, and what they understood they would not have, was the access that the innermost ring of Astor-level society possessed. This was not simply a matter of hurt feelings or wounded pride, though no doubt there was some of that too. It was a practical matter, because in the world of the Gilded Age, the social hierarchy was also, in significant ways, a financial hierarchy. Access to the innermost rings of elite society was access to the networks through which business was done, and marriages were arranged, and estates were managed, and trusts were directed. Being outside those rings meant being outside those networks, which meant a degree of financial vulnerability that the women who were outside them understood very well. Mrs. Orme's séances, in which the dead William Backhouse Astor Jr. expressed views about the proper organisation of the social world, views that were, conveniently, somewhat more generous than those of his living wife, can be understood in this light. They were not merely an exercise in imagination or an expression of social frustration. They were, in their way, a practice of the alternative world that Mrs. Orme and the women who gathered in her drawing room needed, and could not otherwise access. The alternative world that the medium created was a world in which the social arrangements of the visible world could be questioned and rearranged, a world in which the dead patriarch could say, "The decisions my wife has been making are not the decisions I would have made," a world in which the women who'd been excluded could be acknowledged as deserving of inclusion, not by the living authority of the social arbiter, but by the posthumous authority of the man in whose name the social arbiter had always claimed to act. This was, in the most literal sense, a use of the invisible to manage the visible. And it was not entirely unsuccessful. The women who gathered in Mrs. Orme's drawing room and received the posthumous permission of the dead Astor patriarch were not, immediately, admitted to the drawing room on Fifth Avenue. The social hierarchy did not rearrange itself overnight because a medium had spoken, but the gathering itself, the community formed around the practice, the mutual recognition of shared exclusion and shared aspiration, the intelligence shared about the social world and the people who moved through it, was a form of social power in its own right. They knew things, they observed things. They had, through the medium's practice, developed a habit of attention to the invisible dimensions of social life, to what was not said, to what was meant by the things that were said, to the currents of feeling and intention that ran beneath the surface of social performance. This attention, this cultivated sensitivity to the invisible, was not merely a spiritual practice, it was a social skill of the highest order. And the women who had developed it were better equipped, in many respects, than the women who relied entirely on the visible and the official. The social calculus of the invisible, the understanding that the official arrangements of a society are never the whole of that society, that the visible hierarchy is always shadowed by an invisible one, that the most important things are always happening in rooms you have not been invited to and conversations you have not been present for, and that the woman who can sense what is happening in those rooms and those conversations without having been there has a significant advantage over the woman who cannot. The medium trained this sense. She did not create it. The women who consulted mediums already possessed it to varying degrees, but she refined it. She created the context in which it was exercised and valued and developed. She gave it a language and a practice. And the women who had it, who had cultivated it in the parlours of mediums and in the drawing rooms where they discussed what the medium had communicated and how to use it, carried it with them into every other room they occupied. Margaret Stratton's practice raises a question that runs through the whole history of Gilded Age spiritualism and that deserves more direct address than it usually receives. The question of what it means to be authentic in a practice that involves so many layers of performance. The investigative literature on spiritualism tends to frame the question of authenticity as a binary. Either the medium was genuinely receiving communications from the dead, or she was not, and if she was not, she was a fraud. This binary is too simple, and applying it too rigidly misses most of what was actually happening in the practice. Margaret Stratton was performing. She knew she was performing. She had constructed the role she occupied, the woman of unusual attunement, the advisor with access to dimensions of a situation that others could not perceive, through deliberate choices about presentation and self-cultivation. She was not, in the ordinary sense, receiving communications from the dead, and yet she was also, genuinely, perceiving things. She had developed, through years of careful attention to the social world she moved in, a real capacity for insight into the situation she was asked to advise on. The information she provided was not fabricated. The assessments she made were, more often than not, accurate. The sense she projected of knowing things that were not available through ordinary means was grounded in knowledge that was, in fact, not available through ordinary means, not because it came from the spirits, but because it came from decades of careful observation that most people do not undertake, and from the kind of social intelligence that can look, to the uninitiated, like supernatural perception. She was authentic, in other words, about the less remarkable version of what she claimed to be. She was not receiving messages from the dead, but she was genuinely perceiving things that others around her were not perceiving. She was genuinely offering insight that was valuable and often accurate. She was genuinely providing the women who came to her with a resource that they could not easily obtain elsewhere. The performance was a frame around this genuine capacity, not a substitute for it. The frame was necessary. In the social world she inhabited, a woman who said, "I have been observing your family's situation carefully, and I have come to some conclusions," would not have been received with the same weight as a woman who said, "I am in contact with forces that are telling me certain things about your situation." The frame was what gave the capacity its authority. This is not an uncommon arrangement. Most professional authority is partly framed by performance, by the accumulated signs of expertise, by the manner and the credentials and the context that tell an observer that this person knows things worth listening to. The doctor's white coat is a frame. The lawyer's office is a frame. The academic's degrees are a frame. These frames are not fraudulent, even though they are constructed. They are necessary context for the exercise of genuine capacity. Margaret Stratton's frame was the frame of spiritualism, and within that frame she exercised genuine capacity that produced genuine results for the women she served. Whether this constitutes fraud is a question worth sitting with. The frame was not, strictly speaking, accurate. She was not in contact with the dead. But the capacity it framed was real, and the results it produced were real, and the women who came to her received something of genuine value. The question of authenticity in the medium's practice is ultimately the question of what we want authenticity to mean. If we want it to mean the accurate representation of the metaphysical mechanism underlying the practice, then most of what went on in the parlours of Gilded Age mediums was not authentic. But if we want it to mean the honest provision of something genuinely valuable to the people who sought it, then the picture is considerably more complicated. Margaret Stratton was, on this second account, more authentic than her critics would have credited. She knew what she was doing, she did it well, and the women who came to her were better off for having done so. Whether the spirits had anything to do with it remains as always an open question. There is a particular hour in late October, in the old brownstone neighbourhoods of New York, when the light does something that is difficult to describe and impossible to replicate in any other season. It comes through the yellow leaves of the trees, filtered and softened, and it falls across the stone facades of the houses in a way that makes them look ancient and warm at the same time. The lampposts have not yet been lit. The carriages are still on the streets. The day has not quite finished. In the houses that face Gramercy Park during this hour, in the 1890s, women are doing the same things that women in these houses always do at this hour. They are writing letters at small desks near the windows. They are consulting with their housekeepers about the arrangements for the evening. They are sitting with their embroidery in the fading light, working on pieces that will not be finished for months. And in some of these houses, in rooms that face the garden rather than the street, there are women who are not doing any of these things. They are sitting in chairs with their eyes closed, or they are standing at windows looking at something that is not quite in the garden, or they are reading, not the novels or the social correspondence that make up most of the reading in these houses, but thinner volumes with hand-printed titles and illustrations that suggest the invisible world just behind the visible one. Spiritualism, by the 1890s, had acquired a literature of its own that was substantial enough to fill a small library. There were theoretical texts on the nature of spirit communication and its implications for theology and science. There were practical guides to the conduct of séances and the interpretation of the communications received. There were biographical accounts of famous mediums and their clients, accounts that read like both testimonial and cautionary tale, depending on which side of the question the reader was already on. The women in the Gramercy Park houses who read these volumes were reading them for the same reasons people have always read books, to understand their own experience, to find in the organised intelligence of other people's thinking some framework for the things they were feeling and the choices they were facing. The choices they were facing were often about money. Not always, not even usually in the simple transactional sense of the Whitmore will or the Hetty-Jones settlement. More often, the choices were about something that had money in it the way a river has water. You could not separate the one from the other, because the money was the medium through which everything else moved. How to manage an estate that a dead husband had left in ambiguous condition. How to deal with children who had conflicting claims and conflicting expectations. How to navigate the relationship between a woman's legal rights, which were limited, and her practical authority, which in many cases was considerable but unrecognised. How to make the arguments that needed to be made in a world where a woman's word, standing alone, was insufficient to close a question that men had left open. The medium offered a way of closing those questions, not always with a spirit message, not always with a formal séance, sometimes simply with her presence, with the implication that there were things she knew and could say, if asked, that would complicate the neat narrative the other side was telling. In one of the Gramercy Park houses, in the autumn of 1897, a woman named Helena Fiske was working her way through exactly this kind of complication. Helen Fiske was 56 years old, a widow of 4 years, in possession of a life interest in her late husband's estate, under terms that were straightforward in their language and complicated in their application. The life interest gave her the income from the estate during her lifetime, with the principal going to her stepchildren at her death. It did not give her the authority to make major decisions about the management of the assets. That authority rested with a board of trustees composed of her husband's former business partners and his eldest son from his first marriage. The trustees had not, in the 4 years since her husband's death, managed the estate in ways that Helena found satisfactory. Decisions were made without her input. Properties were sold at what she considered inadequate prices. The income distributed to her, while technically meeting the requirements of the trust document, was calculated in ways that consistently favoured the preservation of principal and the eventual benefit of the stepchildren over her present needs. She had gone to lawyers who told her that the trust was being managed within its terms. She had appealed to the trustees directly and been heard with the polite inattention of men who had made their decisions and saw no reason to revisit them. She came in the end to a medium, a woman named Adelaide Cross, who worked from a house on Irving Place and who had a reputation for receiving communications from the recently dead that were unusually specific about matters of business and finance. What happened in the séances that Adelaide Cross conducted for Helena Fiske over the winter of 1897 and 1898 was not, in itself, dramatic. Helena's husband communicated his dissatisfaction with the trustees' management. He communicated specific observations about decisions that had been poorly made. He communicated his wish that his wife be treated as a genuine partner in the management of his estate rather than as a beneficiary to be managed. These communications were not by themselves legally actionable. What they provided was something different, a sense of authorization. Helena Fisk emerged from the séances with a confidence in her own judgments that she had not previously been able to maintain in the face of the trustees' dismissal. She wrote letters that were more assertive. She made requests that were more specific. She engaged a new attorney who specialized in trust disputes and who found in the trust documents certain provisions that the original trustees had been interpreting in their own favor. The trustees did not change their management dramatically, but they changed it somewhat, and Helena's income over the remaining years of her life was somewhat better than it had been. Was this the medium's doing? In any direct sense, no. The medium had not produced evidence. The medium had not changed the law. What the medium had done was provide Helena Fisk with the sense that her own perceptions were accurate, and her claims were legitimate, that the dead man whose estate she was fighting over would, if he could speak, say what she believed he would say. That sense of authorization, in a world where women's claims were routinely dismissed or minimized, was not nothing. It was in some cases the difference between pursuing the argument and giving it up. The evening falls on Gramercy Park. The lampposts come on one by one, casting pools of yellow light on the stone sidewalks. The carriages are fewer now. The houses are lighting their windows. In the room that faces the garden, the woman with her eyes closed is sitting very still, waiting for the medium to speak. Whatever she hears in that room, whatever sense she makes of what the medium tells her, she will carry with her when she leaves. She will carry it to the lawyer's office and to the trustees' meeting, and to the dinner table, where the question of what she is owed will be discussed, again, by people who would prefer to have already settled it. She will carry it the way women in these houses have always carried the things they know to be true, quietly, persistently, with the particular combination of patience and determination that the times have required and that the times have never adequately credited. The women who used spiritualism as a strategy in the management of their inheritances were not, for the most part, cynics. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand about them, and it is the thing that is most easily misunderstood from the vantage point of a later century. The later century tends to see these stories as stories about fraud, about the exploitation of grief by calculating women who deployed the medium as a tool, the way a lawyer deploys a contract or a politician deploys a speech. And there are cases in which that description is accurate enough. There are cases in which the medium was hired for purely instrumental purposes, in which neither the client nor the medium believed in the possibility of spirit communication, and in which the whole enterprise was, from beginning to end, a calculated manipulation of the credulous or the emotionally vulnerable. But this is not the whole story, not even most of it. Most of the women in these stories were genuine believers, or genuine half-believers, women who held the question of spirit communication open in the way that thoughtful people in every era hold questions open when the stakes of being wrong in either direction are very high. They wanted to believe. They had reasons to believe. The dead they were trying to reach were real people whom they had loved, and the loss of those people was real loss, and the need for some form of continued connection was real need. What they found in the medium, and what they found in the séance, was not simply a weapon. It was also a consolation. It was also a space in which they could continue, for an hour or an evening, the relationships that death had interrupted. It was also, in many cases, the only place in their lives where their grief was taken seriously, and their claims were treated as legitimate. The parlour séance was a woman's room in a way that very few rooms in the Gilded Age were women's rooms. The medium was almost always a woman. The clients were almost always women. The language of the séance was the language of personal relationship, of love and loss, and the continuing bonds between people. It was not the language of business or law, of contracts and precedents, and the accumulated weight of decisions made by men about other men's affairs. In the séance, a woman's grief was the organizing principle. Her loss was the centre of the story. Her need for communication was the engine of the whole enterprise. This was not a small thing in a world where a woman's grief was expected to be tidied away after an appropriate period, where her needs were routinely subordinated to the management of estates and the convenience of trustees, where her claims on what she was owed were measured against the priorities of people who had more legal standing and less actual connection to the dead. The medium gave her something back, not the person she had lost. Nothing could give her that, but a sense that the person was still present, still concerned, still invested in her welfare, a sense that the claims she was making were not merely hers but were endorsed by someone whose voice carried weight that no living authority had been able to supply. Was this belief accurate? Was there something on the other side of the medium's closed eyes and quiet voice that was genuinely the spirit of the dead? This is not a question that can be answered here. It is not, in fact, a question that has been definitively answered anywhere in all the decades since the Fox sisters claimed to hear rapping in that farmhouse in Hydesville. The science of the period investigated spiritualist claims with increasing sophistication, and found most of them wanting. The mediums who were investigated tended to fail under controlled conditions. The phenomena that seemed most compelling in the warmth of a private parlour seemed less impressive under experimental scrutiny. But the investigation of fraud does not exhaust the question of belief. The fact that many mediums were frauds does not mean that all of them were, or that the clients who believed in them were simply credulous. It means that the situation was complicated, as situations involving grief and hope, and the desire for something that cannot be obtained through ordinary means tend to be complicated. What matters for this story is not the metaphysical question of whether the spirits were real. What matters is the practical question of what belief in them accomplished, what it gave to the women who believed, and what it allowed them to do that they could not have done without it. And what it accomplished was considerable. It gave them a language for their claims that operated outside the legal structures that constrained them. It gave them a form of authority that their adversaries could not easily dismiss. It gave them a space in which their perceptions were treated as valid and their needs were taken seriously. And in a number of specific, documented cases, it gave them a tool for renegotiating the distribution of wealth in ways that left them substantially better off than the written documents had provided. The women who deployed spiritualism strategically were not departing from their beliefs. They were applying them. They were using in the service of their practical needs the same framework they used in the service of their personal consolation. The medium was not a separate realm from everyday life. She was woven into it, present in the drawing rooms of women who were managing grief and money simultaneously, offering something that addressed both. The spirits left behind something that the legal system never acknowledged, and the historical record only partially captures: the sense, for women in a world that limited their power at every turn, that the invisible world was on their side. That the dead supported them. That the authority they needed, which the living world would not provide, was available if they knew how to ask for it. Whether this was true or not, it was useful, and in the Gilded Age, in the drawing rooms of women who had limited options and unlimited need, useful was not a small thing. The inheritance of the spiritualist strategy did not always take the form of wealth. Sometimes what passed from mother to daughter in these families was something harder to name: a knowledge of the world's workings, a fluency in the language of the invisible, a confidence in the legitimacy of one's own perceptions that had been purchased at considerable cost and was passed on carefully, in the hope that the next generation would not have to pay the same price. Frances Harrington, no relation to the Frances who appeared in the Astor correspondence, was the daughter of a woman named Clara Harrington, who had used spiritualist strategies in the management of her own inheritance in the 1880s with considerable success. Clara had received, through a combination of spirit messages and shrewd negotiation, a substantially larger share of her father's estate than the will as written had provided. She had managed that share with intelligence and had left her daughter, at her death in 1903, an estate of roughly $400,000. Frances was 28 when her mother died. She had been educated in the European fashion in schools in England and Switzerland, and had returned to New York with the kind of accomplished, cultivated manner that her mother's resources had purchased. She had also, from her childhood in the house where mediums visited regularly, an intimate familiarity with the world of spiritualism that was both more sophisticated and more ambivalent than her mother's. Clara had believed sincerely and without much ambivalence in the reality of spirit communication. Frances was less certain. She'd watched her mother's séances from the edges of the drawing room, as a child who was supposed to be in bed but was not, and what she had observed had given her not faith but understanding, an understanding of the mechanics of the enterprise that coexisted uneasily with genuine uncertainty about whether the mechanics were the whole of it. She did not inherit her mother's certainty. She inherited something more useful, the knowledge of what the medium's presence in a room could accomplish, and the willingness to use that knowledge when circumstances required it. Her circumstances required it almost immediately. Clara's estate had been left to Frances outright. No trust, no trustees, no male management. Clara had taken pains to structure her affairs so that her daughter would have the direct control that she herself had spent years fighting for. The estate was Frances's, and Frances was free to manage it as she saw fit. The problem was the other heirs. Clara had two brothers, both of whom had expected that the residue of their family's original fortune, money that had passed through their parents and had accumulated through Clara's management into something considerably larger than what had been there at the start, would come to them or their children at Clara's death. The will did not provide this. The will gave everything to Frances. The brothers hired lawyers. They challenged the will on grounds of undue influence, specifically undue influence exercised by spiritualist practitioners who had allegedly manipulated Clara's beliefs in ways that distorted her testamentary wishes. This was a new development in the history of spiritualism and inheritance law, and it was a significant one. The men who challenged wills for spiritualist influence were not claiming that the mediums had produced fraudulent spirit messages to redirect the estate. They were claiming that the practice of spiritualism itself was a form of mental disturbance, that prolonged exposure to mediums and séances had compromised the testator's judgment in ways that vitiated the will. It was a sophisticated argument, and in the legal climate of the early 20th century, with spiritualism increasingly under scientific and social attack, it had real traction. Frances Harrington sat with her lawyers and assessed the situation with the cool analytical intelligence that she had, by this point understood to be her most reliable asset. The challenge had merit, not because her mother had been mentally incompetent, which she had not been, but because the argument was constructed in a way that would be difficult and expensive to defeat, and because the introduction of her mother's spiritualist practices into a public trial would inevitably raise questions about the practices themselves that could not be fully controlled. She needed to respond on ground that her uncles had not expected, and she needed to do it quickly before the legal proceedings had gained enough momentum to take on a life of their own. Frances engaged a medium. Not to produce spirit messages from her dead mother, not to receive communications that could be deployed as evidence. She engaged the medium for a different purpose, to provide, in private consultations with each of her uncles, the sense that their late sister Clara was present and was aware of what they were doing. The medium Frances hired was a woman named Eleanor Marsh, who had a remarkable ability to create in a private meeting the impression of contact with a specific dead person. She did not hold formal séances. She did not produce physical phenomena or dramatic manifestations. She sat with a person in a quiet room and spoke, in a way that felt absolutely natural about the person who had died, about things she seemed to know from a place that could not be the ordinary social knowledge of someone who had never met the family. She met privately with each uncle, separately by arrangement that Frances never publicly acknowledged. What she said to them exactly is not in the historical record. What happened after she said it is, both uncles withdrew their challenge within 6 weeks of the consultations. Frances Harrington managed her estate until her death in 1941, leaving it to her own daughter with the same directness of structure that Clara had used in leaving it to her. She never spoke publicly about the consultations with Eleanor Marsh, or about the strategic use of spiritualism in the resolution of the estate dispute. She gave an interview to a magazine in 1930, on the occasion of a charitable donation she had made to a women's college, in which she said something that her interviewer noted but did not pursue. That she had learned from her mother that the most important skill a woman could develop was the skill of knowing what other people believed, and being able to speak, with authority, directly to those beliefs. The interviewer asked what she meant. Frances Harrington smiled and changed the subject. Not all the men who encountered the spiritualist strategy in the context of inheritance disputes responded with legal challenges. Some responded with something that looked more like fear. This is not surprising, and it is worth examining carefully, because the fear reveals something about the culture of the Gilded Age that the more dramatic stories, the lawsuits, the settlements, the confrontations across lawyers' desks, tend to obscure. The men who were afraid of the medium were not, for the most part, men who believed in spirits. They were, in fact, often men who were conspicuously skeptical about the whole enterprise, men who attended scientific lectures on the exposure of fraudulent mediums and who subscribed to the journals that published those lectures, and who had decided opinions about the credulity of the women who consulted mediums. They were rational men, practical men, men whose view of the world was organized around the visible and the verifiable. And yet, in specific situations, in specific drawing rooms, in specific conversations with women who were using the language and the practices of spiritualism with evident fluency and authority, these men were afraid. The fear was not, or not primarily, metaphysical. It was not the fear of actually confronting a ghost. It was something more practical and more interesting. It was the fear of an adversary who was operating in a register that they did not know how to respond to. A man who is challenged in a business dispute by another man knows what to do. There are established procedures, there are legal mechanisms, there are social codes about how such disputes are conducted and how they are resolved. The man who challenges him is operating in the same system by the same rules, with the same ultimate recourse to the same institutions. A man who's confronted by a woman who tells him, in the quiet voice of someone conveying information rather than making an argument, that his dead brother has communicated certain things about the disposition of their shared inheritance, this man is not in a situation he knows how to manage. He cannot dispute the message without disputing the reality of the medium's communication, which involves taking a position on a metaphysical question that the respectable opinion of the time had not settled. He cannot simply dismiss the woman without appearing to dismiss both the medium and the dead, which carries its own social costs. He cannot consult a lawyer about the content of the message, because the content is not a legal document. He cannot bring the confrontation into the arena of business or law, because the medium has carefully positioned it outside those arenas. He is left with the choice of engaging on terms that disadvantage him, or retreating on terms that look like capitulation. Neither option is comfortable. Neither option is the kind he is accustomed to facing. The fear, in other words, was the fear of a situation that had been designed to be uncomfortable for exactly the kind of person he was. The medium's strategy, insofar as it was a strategy and not simply the expression of genuine belief, was partly a strategy of displacement, of moving the argument from ground where women were at a disadvantage to ground where men did not know the rules. And on ground where men did not know the rules, women who had spent their lives operating on ground where the rules were always slightly against them had a significant advantage. Richard Aldous Pemberton is a name that appears in several documents from the early 1890s in connection with a dispute over his mother's estate in Philadelphia. He was a wealthy manufacturer, educated at Princeton, a member of the appropriate clubs, a subscriber to the appropriate opinions. He challenged his sister's management of their mother's estate in 1892, citing, among other things, her reliance on a medium named Mrs. Fairweather, who had, he alleged, obtained undue influence over both his sister and their mother. His sister, whose name was Georgiana Pemberton, was a woman who had spent 3 years managing their mother's household during the old lady's final illness. She had also, during these 3 years, developed what the historical record suggests was a genuine commitment to spiritualism, attending séances, corresponding with other practitioners, and building a network of acquaintances in the spiritualist community that gave her access to information and support that her brother did not have and could not easily obtain. Richard Pemberton filed his challenge in March of 1892. The legal proceedings that followed lasted in their most active phase for about 4 months. They did not reach trial. What ended them was a meeting between Richard Pemberton and Mrs. Fairweather, arranged by Georgiana, in which the medium spoke to Richard, not about his mother and not about the estate, but about his father, who had died 15 years earlier and who had, according to Mrs. Fairweather, something specific and private to say to his elder son. What she said has not been preserved. The meeting was private, conducted without witnesses, and neither Richard Pemberton nor Mrs. Fairweather left an account of it. What happened after the meeting is that Richard Pemberton withdrew his challenge, accepted a modest settlement that Georgiana had offered before the litigation began, and did not discuss the subject again. His granddaughter, interviewed in the 1950s for an oral history project, remembered that her grandfather had become, in his later years, very reluctant to speak dismissively about spiritualism, and that on the one occasion when the subject had come up at a family dinner he had said, with a finality that closed the conversation, that there were things in the world that educated men did not understand. He did not say what those things were. He did not need to. The light is changing in the houses on Fifth Avenue. It has been changing for years, gradually, in the way that things change when no single day marks the turning, when the alteration is made by the accumulation of small differences rather than by a single decisive event. The year is 1905, and the world that produced the séances and the spirit messages and the drawing room negotiations is still present, but only just. It is present the way an August afternoon is present at the end of August, in the warmth of the air and the length of the shadows, but with something underneath it that suggests the season is already moving toward a close. The women in these houses are older now than they were when this story began. Some of them are dead. Some of them have moved to smaller residences as the great fortunes have contracted, and the great houses have become, as so many great Gilded Age houses became, too expensive to maintain, and too specific in their architecture to serve any other purpose. The ballrooms and the conservatories and the suites of formal rooms designed for a social performance that fewer people were still willing to undertake have become in some cases museums of a kind of living that is already beginning to seem historical. But the séances continue, the mediums still visit, the parlours are still darkened in the late afternoon, and the gas lamps, or now, in the newer houses, the electric lights, are still turned low, and the circle is still formed, and the medium still settles into her chair with the composed expression of someone who has done this many times and believes in what she is doing. What's different in 1905 is the audience. The women consulting mediums now are not in many cases the same women who were consulting them in 1880 or 1885. The generation that had learned spiritualism as part of the broader culture of the Gilded Age, that had grown up in houses where séances were an accepted part of social life, is giving way to a generation that approaches the practice with more ambivalence and less certainty. The daughters and granddaughters have absorbed both the belief and the doubt. They know the strategy. They are not always sure they believe in the premises. But the need remains. The need for a language in which a woman's claims on her own life can be articulated with authority. The need for a space in which grief is the organizing principle rather than the inconvenience. The need for some form of contact with the people who have died and taken with them, permanently and irreversibly, everything they knew and felt and meant to the people who loved them. The medium addresses all of these needs, in the same parlour, in the same low light, with the same quiet voice and the same sense of listening to something on the far edge of audibility. In one of these houses, in the long afternoon of 1905, a woman named Agnes Caldwell, no relation to the Steel Fortune Caldwells of the earlier story, is sitting across a table from a medium named Mrs. Forsyth, and what she wants is simple. She wants to hear her husband's voice. He has been dead for 8 months. He died unexpectedly at 54 of a sudden cardiac event that gave him no time for final words and gave her no time to prepare for the world without him. He was not a wealthy man. The estate he left was modest, a house in Brooklyn, a life insurance policy, some investments. The legal complications of his death were minimal and had been resolved without difficulty. Agnes Caldwell has come to Mrs. Forsyth not for strategy. She has come because she misses her husband with a physical urgency that nothing in her ordinary life addresses, and because the medium is the only person she knows who takes that missing seriously. Mrs. Forsyth hears what Agnes needs and provides it. Whether what she provides is communication from the actual spirit of Agnes's husband, or whether it is the product of a skilled and empathetic woman's ability to model another person's voice and manner and concerns, is a question that does not matter here. What matters is that Agnes Caldwell leaves the séance with the sense of having been in her husband's presence, and that this sense sustains her through the months that follow. This is the other inheritance of Gilded Age spiritualism, not the strategic inheritance, the tool for inheritance disputes, but the consolatory inheritance, the space for grief in a world that had limited patience for it. Both inheritances pass through the drawing rooms of these houses, through the hands of the women who sat in circles around small tables and opened themselves to the possibility of contact with the dead. Both are real. Both matter. The strategic and the consolatory were never cleanly separable in the lives of the women who practiced spiritualism. The woman who sat with a medium hoping to receive a useful message about her inheritance was also a woman who had lost someone. The woman who came for consolation was also a woman who existed in a world of legal and financial complexity that the consolatory message might touch, if only obliquely. They were whole people, living whole lives. The séance addressed the whole life, or tried to. The light is changing. The afternoon is long, but not endless. The parlour is warm, and the medium's voice is quiet, and the city outside the window is going about its business, with the indifference that cities always maintain toward the private dramas of the houses that line their streets. In this room, for this hour, what the city thinks does not matter. What matters is the circle and the candle and the voice that comes from somewhere on the edge of what is ordinarily audible. The medium speaks. The woman across the table listens. Whatever comes through the space between them, whatever is heard in the stillness of the room, becomes part of the story she will carry with her when she leaves. She will carry it carefully, the way she carries everything she values. She will carry it past the lawyers and the trustees and the sons who think they know better than she does. She will carry it into the rooms where the decisions are made, and she will let it inform, quietly and without explanation, the confidence with which she speaks about what she knows to be true. The long afternoon continues, the shadows lengthen, the city moves toward evening. There is a way in which every séance is also an act of historical preservation. The medium who sits with a client and channels the voice of the dead is, whatever else she is doing, insisting on the continued relevance of the dead to the present. She is maintaining, against the natural tendency of time to bury and forget, the presence of people and events and relationships that the ordinary machinery of memory would otherwise gradually erode. In the Gilded Age houses, this function was not small. The dead in these houses were the people who had built the fortunes and established the social positions and made the decisions that determined the shape of the living women's lives. They were the fathers who had accumulated and the husbands who had managed, and the brothers who had controlled, and the lawyers who had structured. They were, in a legal and financial sense, still present in the documents and structures they had left behind, in the trusts and the wills and the investment portfolios. But they were present in another sense too, a sense that the documents did not capture, as people with personalities and preferences and histories that shaped the living women's understanding of who they were and what they were entitled to. The dead man who had told his wife, in a garden on a Sunday morning, that the business was hers and the children's. That dead man was more fully present in the séance, where his words could be recalled and his manner could be reproduced and his ongoing concern for the welfare of his family could be expressed, than he was in the will, which spoke in the abstract language of bequest and distribution. The medium restored the full presence of the dead. She restored not just the legal person but the human being, with all the specificity and texture that the human being had possessed in life. And in restoring the human being, she restored the context in which the documents had been made, the context that gave those documents their meaning and that, when properly articulated, sometimes altered what the documents appeared to say. This is why the medium's most powerful tool was not the dramatic manifestation or the physical phenomenon, but the specific detail, the pet name that only the dead person had used, the memory of a particular afternoon, the observation about a specific financial decision, accurate enough in its particulars to suggest that the speaker had been present when it was made. These details were what moved people, not the general assertion that communication with the dead was possible, but the specific evidence that this communication, here, now, was actually happening. The specific detail was also, of course, the most suspicious element of the medium's practice. The investigators hired by the Whitmore brothers and by other skeptical challengers focused on the specific detail as the site of potential fraud. If the medium knew things she should not have known, the question was how she had come to know them, through spirit communication, or through research, or through the social intelligence that women of this class had developed over lifetimes of careful attention to the world around them. The answer, in most cases, was probably some combination of all three. The medium who was doing her job well was drawing on everything available to her. The background knowledge she had accumulated through her practice, the information her client had provided, the general social knowledge that came from moving in these households over many years, and whatever she believed she received through the channels of spirit communication. What made this combination effective was not that it was fraud, or that it was genuine transmission, but that it was indistinguishable, from the inside, from either. The client could not tell the difference between information that had been researched and information that had come through the veil. The medium herself, in many cases, could not be entirely certain. The boundary between knowing and receiving was blurred in the practice of the séance in ways that made it resistant to the clean categories that the investigators tried to apply to it. In this blurring, The medium was also, in her way, a historian. She was someone who had absorbed the accumulated detail of many lives, the histories of families and fortunes and relationships, the specifics of decisions and conversations and moments that the participants had mostly forgotten or imperfectly preserved. She held this knowledge and returned it, transformed, in the context of the séance. Whether she returned it accurately, whether the historical record she offered was an accurate record or a shaped and selective one, is a question that cannot always be answered. But the question itself is not different in kind from the question we ask about any historical source. Who assembled this? What did they want it to say? What have they selected and why from the infinite complexity of what actually happened? The medium was a historical source of a particular kind, shaped by her own perceptions and purposes, filtered through her clients' needs, operating under conditions that made the usual tools of historical verification largely inapplicable, and yet containing, often enough to matter, something that was genuinely true. The candle on the séance table has been burning for 2 hours. It is not a dramatic candle. It is the kind that can be purchased at any household goods shop, a plain tallow cylinder in a plain brass holder, the kind that every house in the city uses for everyday purposes. It was not brought for the occasion. It was found in the kitchen and carried upstairs. But in the hour since the medium began speaking, the candle has acquired a significance that ordinary candles do not possess. It is the centre of the room. It is the fixed point around which everything else is organised. The medium's face, in its light, seems to belong to a different register of reality than the wallpaper behind her, or the furniture at the edges of the room. The woman across the table in its light seems similarly displaced, present but not quite ordinary, caught in a moment that the ordinary rules of domestic life do not fully govern. Outside the window the city continues its business. Carriages on the street, the distant sound of someone calling, a dog, very briefly, then silence. The city does not know and does not care what is happening in this room. Inside the room, what is happening is simple and not simple at the same time. A woman who has lost someone is sitting in a chair, and across from her is another woman who has spent many years learning how to be present in the particular way that this situation requires. The medium is not performing exactly. She's not enacting a role in the theatrical sense. She's inhabiting a practice that she believes in, a practice that she has observed produce genuine comfort and genuine change in the lives of the people who come to her. She speaks quietly. She does not raise her voice. The voice she speaks in has a quality that is slightly different from her ordinary voice. Not dramatically so, not in a way that suggests trickery or performance, but different enough that the woman across the table understands that something is being attempted that is different from ordinary conversation. What she says draws from everything she knows and everything she perceives and everything she believes she is receiving from the other side of the boundary she is trying to cross. She names the dead man's qualities the way a person who knew him would name them. She recalls the moments that mattered the way a person who was present would recall them. She speaks about the concerns he has, in his current state, for the living woman across the table, concerns about her well-being, about her finances, about the situation that has made her sleepless for weeks. The candle watches all of this. The candle has no opinion. What the woman across the table thinks about what she's hearing is complex and not fully articulable. She thinks, this sounds like him. She thinks, I do not know how she knows this. She thinks, whether or not he is actually speaking through her, what she's saying is what he would have said. She thinks, I needed to hear this. She does not think, this is strategy. She does not think, this is a tool I can use in the negotiation with my brother-in-law. She thinks about her husband. She thinks about the years of the marriage, the ordinary years and the difficult ones, the Sunday mornings and the conversations that seemed unimportant when they happened and seem, now, luminously significant. She thinks, I am still in conversation with him, even now, even after. And that thought, which the medium's practice has made possible, is not a small thing. It is, in fact, one of the more important things she has been given since his death, because it restores to her a relationship that she had understood to be over, and in restoring it, it restores also the authority that the relationship had given her, the authority that comes from being known by someone, understood by someone, valued by someone whose judgment you trust. The candle burns. The medium continues to speak. The woman at the table is very still. Outside, the city moves through the early evening indifferent, efficient, continuous. Horses on cobblestone, a newsboy somewhere calling, the smell of coal smoke from the chimneys of the brownstones, the smell that belongs to these years and this city and no other. Inside the room, there is the smell of tallow and the smell of the roses in the vase on the mantelpiece, and the particular smell of a room where people have been sitting quietly for a long time, the smell of breath and wool and the faint suggestion of whatever perfume the medium wears. The candle sees all of this. The candle keeps no record. When it burns down, as it will, what happened in its light will exist only in the memories of the two women who are present, and in the consequences those memories produce in the days and weeks and months that follow. The consequences will be real. They will show up in letters written and conversations held and decisions made. They will show up in the posture of a woman who enters a difficult meeting with the sense that she is not entirely alone, that someone who loved her has registered his continued concern. They will show up in the settlement documents and the trust amendments and the quiet renegotiations that happen in lawyers' offices without finding their way into the newspapers. But in the room, right now, there are just two women and a candle and the voice that moves between them, and the city outside the window going about its business, and the question that neither of them can answer, and that neither of them needs to answer, in order for the evening to accomplish what it needs to accomplish. The candle burns lower. The medium's voice softens further. The woman at the table closes her eyes. By 1910, the world of Gilded Age spiritualism was under serious attack, and the attack was coming from several directions at once. The psychical research movement, which had begun in England in the 1880s with the founding of the Society for Psychical Research and had established an American branch in 1885, had been investigating mediums with increasing rigour and producing, with increasing frequency, evidence of fraud. The investigators were not, for the most part, hostile to the possibility of genuine spirit communication. They were methodologically serious people who understood the difference between wishing something were true and establishing that it was, and their investigations had turned up repeatedly evidence of the kind of deception that the skeptics had always suspected. Handkerchiefs dipped in phosphorescent paint to simulate spirit hands, accomplices hidden in the furniture, pre-session research conducted by assistants who interviewed neighbours and consulted public records and provided the medium with the specific details she needed to establish credibility. The whole apparatus of theatrical fraud, exposed under controlled conditions, stripped of the warmth and the candlelight and the emotional vulnerability that made it so effective in its natural environment. This was not a complete picture of what mediums did, for the reasons already discussed, but it was an accurate picture of what some mediums did, and the cumulative effect of the exposure was to shift the social meaning of spiritualism from the respectable to the suspect. By 1910, consulting a medium was no longer simply a thing that certain serious, thoughtful people did along with attending church and reading the philosophical literature. It was something that required a degree of social courage, the courage to be seen doing something that had been publicly associated with fraud, even if one's private belief remained firm. For the women who had used spiritualism strategically, this shift in social meaning had practical consequences. The leverage that the spirit message had provided in inheritance disputes depended partly on the credibility that spiritualism commanded in the culture at large. A message from a dead patriarch carried weight, partly because the people on the other side of the negotiation could not simply dismiss it without appearing to take a position on a metaphysical question that respectable culture had left open. Once the culture began to close that question, once the frauds were exposed and the press ran their exposures, and the consensus of educated opinion shifted towards skepticism, the leverage diminished. The spirit message was still usable, but it required more work to deploy and could be countered more easily. The women who had built their strategies around the medium adapted. Some moved to other forms of authority, legal challenges, public advocacy, the organisations of the progressive era that gave women new platforms for pressing their claims. Some continued to use spiritualist strategies but with more discretion, in private negotiations rather than the near-public productions that some of the earlier cases had involved. Some simply retired from the contest, having secured what they needed in the years when the leverage was still effective. The medium herself adapted too. the generation of mediums who emerged in the 1910s and 1920s was, on average, less theatrical and more psychological. The physical manifestations, the spirit hands and the moving furniture and the voices from the air, gave way to a quieter practice that emphasized the emotional and psychological dimensions of spirit communication. The medium became, gradually, something closer to what we would now recognize as a counselor or a therapist, a person who helped clients process grief and navigate difficult life transitions, using a spiritual framework that was more or less explicitly therapeutic in its orientation. This was not a lesser thing, it was a different thing, it addressed different needs with different tools. But the particular intersection of spiritualism and inheritance strategy that had flourished in the Gilded Age was a product of a specific moment, a moment when spiritualism was culturally credible, when women's legal rights were severely constrained, and when the fortunes of the industrial age were being distributed according to the wishes of dead men whose wishes were, inevitably, incomplete and subject to interpretation. As that moment passed, as spiritualism lost its cultural credibility, and women gained legal rights, and the great Gilded Age fortunes were dispersed and taxed and diminished, the strategy became less available and less necessary. It had served its purpose. For the women who had used it, it had been a tool adequate to a specific problem in a specific historical moment, not a universal solution, not a permanent strategy, but a real and effective response to real and constrained circumstances in the drawing rooms of houses where the gas lamps burned low and the medium spoke quietly, and the dead, for an hour or an evening, were allowed to continue caring about the people they had left behind. What the full accounting shows when we sit with it quietly is this. The women of the Gilded Age who used spiritualism strategically were not separated by a vast gulf from the women who used it for consolation, or from the women who used it for both at once. They were women navigating a world that offered them limited tools and significant need, and they used what was available with the intelligence and determination that the world required. The medium was their tool, the séance was their room, the voice of the dead was their authority. And in a world that was otherwise very reluctant to grant them any authority at all, it was sufficient. To understand the women in this story fully, it is necessary to understand the specific legal world they were navigating, the world of coverture and trust law and testamentary rights, and the specific documented ways in which the legal system of the Gilded Age organized the distribution of wealth in ways that routinely disadvantaged women. Coverture was the legal doctrine, inherited from English common law, under which a married woman's legal identity was absorbed into that of her husband. She could not own property in her own name. She could not enter into contracts. She could not sue or be sued independently. Her earnings, if she had them, belonged legally to her husband. Her property, if she had brought it into the marriage, became his to manage, and in some legal systems to spend as he chose. The most comprehensive reform of these rules, the Married Women's Property Acts that had been passed in various forms in most American states between 1839 and 1870, had modified, but not eliminated, the legal disadvantages. A married woman in 1880 could own property in many states, but her right to manage that property, to make investment decisions, to enter into the kinds of business arrangements that determined how an estate would grow or shrink over decades, these rights were still hedged with limitations and uncertainties. Widowhood changed the legal picture considerably. A widow, in most jurisdictions, regained the full legal rights she had surrendered at marriage. She could own property, enter contracts, manage assets, and make the decisions about her own financial life that she had been required to delegate during the marriage. Widowhood was, in the legal landscape of the Gilded Age, a form of emancipation, partial, often temporary, always complicated by the question of what the dead husband's will had actually provided. And this is where the complications began. The typical arrangement in the wills of wealthy Gilded Age men was not a simple bequest to the surviving wife. It was a trust arrangement in which the wife received the income from the estate during her lifetime, but did not receive the principal, which was held in trust for the children or grandchildren and managed by trustees. This arrangement protected the family fortune from the risk of the widows remarrying and taking the assets into another family, and it protected it from the risk of the widow's being, as the lawyers who drafted these documents sometimes put it, imprudent in her financial management. The trustees were almost always men, the husband's former business partners, his lawyers, his brothers or brothers-in-law. the men who had been his professional and personal intimates during his life. They had fiduciary obligations to the trust, which meant obligations to the beneficiaries as a whole, not only to the widow. And in the interpretation of these obligations, there was considerable room for the exercise of judgment that often reflected the trustee's own views about what the widow needed and what she did not, about what was appropriate for a woman in her situation and what was extravagant or imprudent. A widow who wanted to sell a piece of property because she thought it was overvalued could be blocked by trustees who disagreed. A widow who wanted to make a new investment because she saw an opportunity could be blocked by trustees who found the opportunity unsuitable. A widow who wanted simply to understand how her estate was being managed could find herself in the position of requesting information from men who had no legal obligation to explain their decisions in terms she could evaluate. These situations were not unusual. They were, in fact, the routine condition of wealthy widowhood in the Gilded Age, and the women who found themselves in this condition had very limited legal recourse for the simple reason that the trust documents had been designed and executed by lawyers who understood the legal system thoroughly and had structured the arrangements in ways that minimized the widow's ability to challenge them. Into this world came the medium. She could not change the trust documents. She could not grant the widow legal rights she did not possess. She could not give her authority in the board meetings of the trustees. But she could do something that the legal system could not do, which was to create the impression, powerful and difficult to dismiss in a culture that took the idea seriously, that the dead man whose estate was at issue had views about what was happening to it, and was expressing those views through a channel that the trustees could not entirely ignore without appearing to disrespect the dead. The medium created, in other words, a constituency for the widow's position that operated outside the legal framework, a constituency composed of the dead and of those who believed in their continued presence and authority, a constituency that could not be voted down in a board meeting because it was not subject to the rules of board meetings, a constituency that was embarrassing to oppose in public because opposing it meant declaring, in terms that any newspaper could report, that one did not believe the dead husband's expressed wishes mattered. It was a brilliant strategic insight, and it did not require supernatural belief to appreciate its brilliance. It required only the understanding that the law was not the only source of authority in the world, and that in a culture where the dead retained a meaningful social presence, where they were prayed for and memorialized and held as continuing members of the family community, their supposed wishes had weight that no legal structure could entirely eliminate. The medium made that weight available. She put it on the widow's side of the scale. The scale did not always tip. The strategy was not infallible. The Hetty Green case failed. There were others that failed, cases that have been lost to the historical record, or that survive only as cautionary examples in the legal literature on undue influence. The medium was a powerful tool, but she was not a magic one. But she was real, and she worked often enough to matter, and the women who used her understood precisely what she was for and how she fit into the larger landscape of the strategies available to them. This is the legal world that produced these women. This is the specific architecture of disadvantage that shaped their needs and their choices and their remarkable intelligence in identifying and deploying the tools that were available to them. When we look at them, we should see not the credulous or the calculating in isolation, but the intelligent and the constrained, women who understood the rules of the game they were playing and who found, in the figure of the medium and the practice of the séance, a move that the game's designers had not anticipated and could not easily counter. It would be incomplete to examine the strategies of the women who hired mediums without examining, at least briefly, the mediums themselves, the women who made the whole enterprise possible, and who have been, in this telling as in most tellings, somewhat in the background. The mediums of the Gilded Age were a diverse group. They ranged from women of genuine belief who practiced with complete sincerity, to women who were, by any honest assessment, engaged in sustained and systematic fraud. Most of them occupied the complicated middle ground between these poles as we have discussed, women who believed in some version of what they were doing, and who also understood that the practice required skill and management, and the strategic deployment of information that did not come through supernatural channels. What they shared, across the range of their individual practices and beliefs, was a remarkable level of competence in a specific set of social and psychological skills. They were, first and foremost, extremely good listeners. The medium who could not listen, who talked too much, who imposed her own framework too aggressively, who failed to pick up on the subtle signals of what her client actually needed, was not a successful medium for long. The practice required a quality of attention that went beyond ordinary social listening, a receptivity to the full texture of what another person was communicating, including the things they were communicating without intending to. They were also skilled at managing expectations. A client who came to a séance expecting a complete, unambiguous, fully detailed message from a specific dead person was going to be disappointed, because no medium could reliably produce such messages on demand. The medium who survived in practice was the one who could help her clients calibrate their expectations, who could create a framework in which partial messages, ambiguous communications, impressions and feelings that might or might not come from the dead were experienced as meaningful rather than as failures. This was a form of expectation management that required both psychological insight and considerable social skill. They were also, in many cases, extensively informed about the families they served. This information came from many sources, from the clients themselves, who told the medium far more than they realized in the course of establishing the context for a session, from the wider social networks of the neighborhoods where the medium practiced, from the newspapers and social registers that documented the affairs of the wealthy, and, in cases where the medium had built long-term relationships with a family, from years of accumulated observation of the family's history and the relationships within it. This information was not, in the moral universe of the critics, supposed to be used. It was supposed to arrive, if it arrived at all, through supernatural channels. But the medium who waited only for supernatural channels, who refused to supplement the messages she received with the human intelligence she had accumulated, was a medium who would often have nothing to say. The practice required the blend, and the blend is what it was. What the mediums gave to the women who hired them was not simply the performance of spirit communication, it was the sustained attention of a skilled practitioner who had accumulated significant knowledge about the specific situation at hand, and who was willing, within the frame of the practice, to apply that knowledge in the service of the client's needs. This is not nothing, it is in fact rather a lot, and the women who received it valued it accordingly. The social history of the medium in the Gilded Age is a history of women providing skilled services to other women in a world where skilled services were difficult to access. The lawyer served the man with the estate, the physician served the man with the illness, the medium served the woman with the grief and the trust dispute, and the question that would not answer itself. She was a professional in the fullest sense, in an era that was barely beginning to acknowledge that women could be professionals. She operated in the margins of respectability, doing work that the mainstream considered suspect, serving a clientele that the mainstream preferred not to acknowledge as having legitimate needs. And she was, within her specific domain, extraordinarily effective. The children who grew up in Gilded Age households where spiritualism was practiced regularly received an unusual education. They learned first that the dead were not entirely gone. Whatever the children made of this intellectually, the experience of growing up in a household where séances were held and where the presence of the dead was treated as a live possibility, created in them a different relationship to loss than the children of purely secular or conventionally religious households possessed. They learned, second, that there were ways of knowing that were different from the ways of knowing that school and the official culture taught. The medium's practice modelled a kind of attention to the invisible, to the emotional undercurrent of a situation, to what was not being said as well as what was, that was quite different from the empirical analytical attention that the schools of the period valued and taught. The children who absorbed this kind of attention were, in some respects, better equipped to navigate the emotional complexity of their adult lives than their peers. They learned, third, that women could exercise a form of authority that was not derived from the official structures of the world, not from legal standing or economic power or social position, but from something less definable and, in the context of the séance, potentially more powerful. The medium's authority was not reducible to any of the categories that the official world recognized. It was something else, something that operated in the spaces between those categories, and the children who witnessed it were given, by that witnessing, an education in the possibility of unofficial authority. These were not straightforward lessons. They were complicated by the mixed experience of watching the practice, watching the moments when it seemed to work, when something in the room changed and the dead person seemed genuinely present, and watching the moments when nothing came through, when the medium struggled and the silence in the room was simply silence. The children learned, along with everything else, that the invisible world was not reliably available, that access to it required conditions that could not always be arranged, that the most that could be said, after a lifetime of watching, was that the question remained open. This too was an education. The capacity to sit with an open question, to neither insist on the supernatural nor dismiss it, to hold the uncertainty and function within it. This is not a skill that most formal education provides. The children of spiritualist households, whatever else they took from their upbringing, often possessed it. The ones who went on to do significant things with it, the writers, the reformers, the social workers, the lawyers who specialized in the rights of women, the psychologists who were beginning, in the early 20th century, to develop the tools for understanding the inner life. These were people who had been educated, in the drawing rooms of their childhood, in the reality of what is not visible and the importance of attending to it. William James, who was not himself the child of a spiritualist household, but who became, through his adult investigation of spiritualist phenomena, one of the most thoughtful critics and defenders of the practice, said something that captures this education precisely, that the most important questions are the ones that cannot be answered by looking harder at the evidence, because the evidence is always insufficient, and the question is always larger than what the evidence can support. The capacity to remain oriented and functioning in the face of this insufficiency is, he thought, one of the central requirements of a fully human life. The children of the Gilded Age drawing rooms where mediums sat in circles and the dead were invited to speak had, for better or worse, received a thorough education in exactly this capacity. They carried it forward. The women's suffrage movement and the spiritualist movement of the Gilded Age shared more common ground than their separate historiographies usually acknowledge. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was the primary intellectual architect of the women's suffrage movement in the United States, engaged seriously with spiritualism throughout her long career. She did not uncritically endorse it. She was too clear-eyed and too analytical for that. But she recognized in the medium's practice something that resonated with her own analysis of women's position in the social order. The insistence on women's perceptions as valid, on women's claims as legitimate, on the right of women to be heard and taken seriously in a world that routinely dismissed them. She recognized, too, the specific legal and financial arguments that the medium's deployment in inheritance disputes illustrated. The argument that the official distribution of wealth in the American family was not just or natural, but the product of specific legal arrangements that had been made by men for the benefit of men, and that could therefore be challenged and reformed. The medium made this argument in the drawing room. The suffragists made it in the legislatures and the newspapers and the streets. The arguments were different in form and different in their mode of address, but they were recognizably related in their underlying logic. Both were saying in different registers that the official arrangements were not inevitable, that the women who'd been left out of them were not obliged to accept the exclusion, and that the tools for challenging the exclusion were available if one had the intelligence and the courage to use them. The suffragists were the more visible challengers, the ones who appear in the history books and who are credited rightly with the changes in law and social structure that the movement produced. The women who deployed mediums in inheritance disputes were the less visible challengers, the ones who do not appear in the history books and whose victories were private and undocumented and unacknowledged. But both groups were doing the same underlying work, insisting on the legitimacy of claims that the official world did not recognize, and finding the tools to make those claims in the spaces where the official world's reach was limited. The drawing room séance was one such space. It was protected from official intervention by the privacy of the domestic sphere, by the cultural weight of religious practice, and by the awkwardness of officially acknowledging that something morally or legally questionable had occurred in the context of a widow's attempt to communicate with her dead husband. Challenging what happened in that room required exposing things that the official world, in its own dignity, preferred not to discuss. The suffrage meeting was another such space, and the settlement house, and the labour union, and the women's college, and the 100 other informal institutions that women built in the margins of the official world during the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era. What connects all these spaces is not ideology. The suffragists and the women who hired mediums did not share an ideology in any simple sense. What connects them is strategy, the strategy of finding, in the margins of the official world, the spaces where the official world's usual mechanisms of exclusion and dismissal do not quite reach, and building in those spaces the authority and the community and the resources that the official world declines to provide. The medium's room was one such space, small, private, dimly lit, presided over by a woman whose authority was not recognized by any official institution and whose practice was increasingly suspect to the official culture. And yet, in that room, something happened that the official world could not simply undo. Something was heard, something was received, something was taken by the woman who had come with her grief and her need and her careful strategic intelligence and carried back into the world where it would do what she needed it to do. This is the other history of the Gilded Age, not the history of the men who built the railroads and the steel mills and the banks, though that history is real and important. The history of the women who built, in the spaces those men left unoccupied, the practices and the networks and the strategies that allowed them to survive and sometimes to thrive in the world those men were making. The medium is part of that history, a small part, perhaps, an eccentric and contested and sometimes fraudulent part, but a real part. She sat in the room, and she listened, and she spoke, and she held the grief, and she deployed the voice of the dead in the service of the living, and what she produced in the lives of the women she served was not nothing. It was, often enough to matter, exactly what they needed. Let us hold that as we move toward the quiet end of the evening. Let us hold the image of the room and the candle and the two women and the question that hangs between them, the question that neither of them can answer and both of them are keeping alive. The question of what persists. The question of what the dead leave behind when they go, beyond the legal documents and the bank accounts and the structures of trust and inheritance that the lawyers manage. What persists of the love, of the knowledge of each other, of the specific texture of a life shared over decades with another person who is now gone. The medium sat with that question, séance after séance, year after year in the drawing rooms of the Gilded Age. She never resolved it. No one has. But she kept it alive. And keeping it alive, in the face of the world's tendency to declare all such questions settled and all such absences permanent, this was, in its quiet way, a remarkable act. In the 1880s, a group of scientists and philosophers in England founded an organisation called the Society for Psychical Research, with the explicit purpose of investigating the claims of spiritualism using the methodologies that science had developed for investigating other claims about the natural world. They were not, as a group, hostile to spiritualism. Many of them were genuinely open to the possibility that some of the phenomena being reported were real. They simply wanted to know, with the kind of rigour that distinguished knowledge from hope. The American branch of the Society for Psychical Research was founded in 1885, and among its early members were some of the most distinguished intellectuals in the country. William James, the philosopher and psychologist, Richard Hodgson, the investigator, G. Stanley Hall, the psychologist, and a number of others whose credentials were impeccable and whose openness to the investigation was genuine. What they found over the following decades of investigation was complicated. They found fraud, often and extensively. They found mediums who used mechanical devices to produce phenomena that appeared supernatural. They found accomplices hidden in furniture, in adjacent rooms, in elaborate networks of deception that required considerable ingenuity and organisation to maintain. They found, in the most famous case of the period, that the celebrated medium Eusapia Palladino, who had been endorsed by multiple European investigators as producing genuine phenomena, was in fact producing them through a combination of physical skill and the willingness to cheat whenever she thought she could get away with it. They also found, less commonly and with considerably more ambiguity, cases that they could not explain. The most discussed of these was the case of a medium named Leonora Piper, a Boston woman who submitted to investigation by William James and his colleagues over a period of many years, and who produced in session after session information that the investigators found genuinely difficult to account for through mundane means. Mrs. Piper's communications were specific. They were often accurate about details that the investigators had verified, and that could not easily have been obtained through the research and social intelligence that explained most mediumistic performances. James was careful. He did not conclude that Mrs. Piper was receiving genuine communications from the dead. He concluded that her case was one of the genuinely puzzling ones. that the information she produced exceeded what he could explain through ordinary means, and that this excess was significant even if he could not determine what it signified. His statement of the epistemological situation was, and remains, among the most precise available. The investigator of psychical phenomena is always working in the space between the explainable and the inexplicable, and the honest conclusion is that the space is real, that there are things that happen in the context of mediumistic practice that cannot be reduced to fraud or self-deception, even if they cannot be confirmed as genuine spirit communication. For the women of the Gilded Age who were consulting mediums in their drawing rooms, the scientific investigation of spiritualism was a distant backdrop. They were not, in most cases, reading the journals of the Society for Psychical Research or following the detailed technical debates about methodology and evidence that occupied the investigators. They were sitting in a room with a woman who spoke to them in the voice of the dead, and what they were weighing was not scientific evidence but the testimony of their own experience. And their own experience, in case after case, was that the medium knew things she should not have known, spoke with a specificity that exceeded what social intelligence or research could explain, and produced in the encounter the sense of genuine contact with someone who was gone. Whether this sense was accurate is the question. The answer is, we still do not know. The investigators did not resolve it. The science of the period did not resolve it. The science of subsequent periods has not resolved it. The question remains open in exactly the way that William James described, as something that the honest investigator cannot declare settled without claiming more certainty than the evidence provides. For the women in the houses on Fifth Avenue and Gramercy Park and Prospect Park West, this uncertainty was livable. They were accustomed to uncertainty. They were accustomed to proceeding in the face of incomplete information and to making their best judgments about situations that could not be fully verified. They applied this capacity to the question of the medium as they applied it to everything else in their lives, and they arrived at positions that were workable, that allowed them to act, that provided the authority they needed for the particular situations they were navigating. This was not anti-intellectual, it was practical in the deepest sense, the sense of being adequate to the demands of a complex and irreducibly uncertain situation. There is a vocabulary that the medium brought to her work, a vocabulary for talking about loss and absence and the desire for continued connection, that was, in the Gilded Age, not easily available elsewhere. The churches offered a vocabulary for death, of course. They offered the language of resurrection and eternal life, and the communion of saints, the language of meeting again in a world beyond this one. This language was genuine and sustaining for many people, and it should not be minimized. But it was also, for many of the women in the houses where mediums visited, inadequate to the specific texture of what they were experiencing. The inadequacy was not doctrinal, it was personal. The language of the church was about the general, about the soul and its destiny, about the afterlife as a condition rather than as the continuation of a specific relationship between two specific people. What the women who hired mediums wanted was not the general. They wanted the particular. They wanted to hear, not that their husbands were with God, but what their husbands thought about the specific situation they were facing right now, today, in the context of this dispute over this estate and these trustees and this question about what he would have wanted. The medium provided the particular. She provided the voice of the specific dead person, speaking to the specific situation of the specific living person in front of her. She provided, or attempted to provide, the continuation of the actual conversation, not the abstraction of eternal life, but the continuation, however partial and uncertain, of the specific ongoing negotiation of two specific people's relationship. This was what the churches could not provide, and what the legal system could not provide, and what the social world of the Gilded Age, with its strict requirements of conducted and composed grief, emphatically could not provide. The medium provided the space in which the actual relationship, with its messiness and its incompleteness, and its specific texture of argument and love and ordinary misunderstanding, could be continued. This was her most intimate service, and it was, in many ways, her most important one. The strategic deployments we have been examining, the Whitmore will, the Hetty-Jones settlement, the Harrington estate dispute, were real and important. But they were the visible surface of a practice that was, in its deepest layer, about the management of loss, about the refusal to accept that the conversations that mattered most had been permanently terminated, about the insistence that the dead were still present, still concerned, still capable of being heard if one created the right conditions for hearing. This insistence is not unique to the Gilded Age. It appears in every culture and every era, in forms that vary enormously, but that share this underlying structure: the refusal of the living to accept the permanent absence of the dead, and the search for forms of continued connection that can sustain the relationship across the boundary that death creates. The Gilded Age form was the medium. Other eras have had other forms. The ancestor shrines of East Asian tradition, the festivals of the dead that appear in almost every culture, the prayers for the dead that persist in most of the world's religions, the writing of grief that produces across centuries one of the most sustained and various bodies of human expression. All of these are responses to the same problem: the problem of how to maintain a relationship with someone who's no longer there to participate in it. The medium was one solution, particular to her moment, shaped by the specific conditions of the world she inhabited. She was, in this sense, doing something very old in a form that was new. She was practicing in the language and the context of her specific historical moment the universal human refusal to let the dead simply be gone. Let us return one more time to the room. It is past midnight. The session ended hours ago. The medium has long since gone home by carriage or surface car, back to whatever household is her own. The fire in the grate has burned down to coals. The candle has guttered out. The chairs that were arranged in a circle are still in their circle, because the woman of the house, after the medium left, did not move them. She went to her own room, and then she came back, and she stood in the doorway for a moment looking at the circle of chairs and the cold grate and the smell of tallow that still hung in the air. She is thinking about what was said. The specific content of the medium's communication is something she will carry with her for a long time, turning it over, testing it against her memory of the person it was supposed to represent, wondering whether it was real or whether it was something else, the medium's intelligence, or her own desire, or some combination that made it impossible to separate the one from the other. She is also thinking about something that is harder to name. She's thinking about the quality of the attention in the room during the session, the quality of being genuinely attended to, of having her grief and her need taken seriously, of being in the presence of someone who was working with evident effort and evident skill to give her something she had not been able to find elsewhere. Whether the communication was genuine, whether the dead man actually spoke through the medium's voice, or whether the voice was entirely the medium's own, either way, someone attended to her. Either way, she was heard. Either way, the thing she most needed, to have the conversation continue, to have the relationship not be permanently over, was given to her, however imperfectly and however provisionally. The chairs are still in the circle, the fire is cold, the street outside is quiet. She stands in the doorway for a long time. Then she goes to bed. In the days that follow, she will write the letter that needs to be written. She will attend the meeting that needs to be attended. She will press the claim that she believes is legitimate, and do it with the confidence that she has, for now, in sufficient supply. She will carry what she heard in this room tonight into all of that. And it will matter. Not because the medium was certainly right, not because the dead man certainly spoke, not because the invisible world certainly intervened in the affairs of the visible one, but because the woman who stood in the doorway and looked at the circle of chairs was changed in some small but real way by what had happened in the room. She was less alone. She was more certain of the legitimacy of her own perceptions. She was carrying into the difficult days ahead the sense that she was not doing this only for herself, but was doing it in alignment with something larger, with what the dead man would have wanted, with what she understood, in the deepest part of her knowledge of him, to be true. This is the gift of the medium at her best, not certainty, not proof, not the resolution of the question that has no resolution. The sense that one is not alone. The sense that the dead are still present, still concerned, still part of the ongoing conversation of a life. The sense that love does not simply stop because one of the people doing the loving has died. This is what the women in the houses on Fifth Avenue and Gramercy Park and Prospect Park West were seeking, when they drew the curtains and arranged the chairs and sent the servants away and waited for the medium to arrive. They were seeking, in the most human and most durable of senses, the continuation of love across the boundary that death creates. Some of them found it, or found something that, in the way that only love can manage, was close enough. There is a quality to the very late hours of the night, the hours past 2 in the morning, when even the city has mostly gone quiet. That is different from any other time. The quality of the silence is different. The darkness outside the window has a density and an absoluteness that the darkness of earlier hours does not. The feeling of being the only person awake in a world full of sleeping people is both solitary and, in its way, expansive. In these hours, the questions that are too loud during the day become quieter and easier to hold. The disputes and the legal proceedings and the negotiations over inheritance that have been occupying the foreground of life recede a little. What remains is simpler and larger, the fact of loss, the fact of continued living in the face of it, the fact that the world goes on, and that one's own presence in it goes on, shaped permanently and irrevocably by the person who is no longer there. The women in these houses spent many such nights in the years after their husbands died. This is not a remarkable fact. It is simply the condition of grief, which does not observe ordinary hours and which tends to be loudest in the silence of the very late night. What is perhaps remarkable is the degree to which these women converted those late hours from despair into something more productive. Not the productive of accomplishment, but the productive of understanding. The productive of sitting with the loss and the love simultaneously, of letting them be present together without requiring either to yield to the other. The medium had given them a framework for this. She had given them the sense that the love was not simply a remnant, a memory of something that had existed, but an ongoing relationship with someone who was still present in some form. And in the late hours of the night, when the day's practicalities had released their grip, and the quiet was absolute and the feeling of the dead person's absence was most acute, this framework was most useful. Not as a consolation exactly, not as a denial of the loss, but as a companion to the loss, a sense that the loss was not the final word, that the person who had died was not simply nowhere, that the relationship continued even if the form of it had changed in ways that were permanent and strange. This is what the medium gave in the end to the women who came to her in the drawing rooms of the Gilded Age. She gave them company in the night. Not the company of the medium herself. The medium was gone, back to her own life, carrying her own knowledge and her own questions about what she did and whether it was what she thought it was. The company of the practice, the company of the framework that said, the dead are present, the conversations continue, the love does not end. Whether this was true, whether the dead were actually present in any form that could be meaningfully described, is the question that cannot be answered and need not be answered to understand what the practice gave. What it gave was the company, and in the long, quiet nights of widowhood, in the houses where the gas lamps had been turned out and the servants were asleep, and the city outside had finally settled into something approaching silence, the company was sufficient. More than sufficient. It was, for the women who had it, everything they needed to make it through to morning. The medium's business was seasonal in ways that reflected the rhythms of grief. Autumn was busy. Autumn brought the anniversaries of summer deaths, the first autumn without someone who had always been there for autumn, the particular cruelty of the beautiful dying down of leaves and light, when you were yourself in a dying down season. Women who had been managing tolerably through the summer, buoyed by the practical demands of the season, found that autumn stripped away the buoyancy and left the loss standing alone in its full size. Winter was busy too, in different ways. The holidays were brutal for the recently bereaved. The family gatherings with an empty chair, the first Christmas without, the social obligations that required one to appear composed and even cheerful in settings that made composure enormously difficult. Women came to mediums in December with a desperation that the autumn sessions did not quite match. Spring was quieter. Spring had a natural consolatory quality that the other seasons lacked. The return of growth, the lengthening light, the world insisting on its own renewal in the face of whatever losses it contained. Spring was the season when women who had been consulting mediums regularly sometimes felt, for the first time since their loss, that they might be able to manage without the sessions, or with fewer of them. Summer was the quietest of all. The wealthy families left the city in summer, retreating to Newport or Bar Harbour or the Berkshires, to the summer cottages and the grand hotels of the resort circuit. The medium's drawing room was empty in summer, or nearly so. The practice paused. The autumn would bring it back. This seasonality was a reflection of the way grief moves through time, which is not the straight line that the culture's official narrative suggests. The actual movement of grief is more like the movement of weather, seasonal and recurring, shaped by the calendar and by the particular memories attached to particular times of year, capable of sudden intensification after periods of relative quiet, resistant to any linear narrative that would make it more manageable. The medium understood this because she worked with it every year. She had seen the autumn return of clients who had been managing well through the summer. She had seen the December urgency. She had seen the spring release. She had built her practice around these rhythms, had learned to meet each season with the quality of attention it required. This knowledge was part of what she carried that was not supernatural. It was accumulated, practical observation of a kind that no official profession of the time had developed. The physicians did not study grief. The lawyers did not study grief. The clergy studied it in theological terms that were not always adequate to the specific emotional texture of the experience. The medium studied it practically, as someone whose livelihood depended on understanding what the bereaved person needed and when they needed it. This was a form of expertise, not the expertise that carried official credentials or appeared in professional directories, but expertise in the practical and important sense, accumulated knowledge of a domain, reliable skill in application, consistent production of outcomes that served the people who came for the service. Not all the women who consulted mediums were convinced by what they found. The historical record includes, among the enthusiastic testimonials and the accounts of remarkable communications, the quieter testimony of women who tried the practice and found it wanting. They came to the séance with hope and left with doubt. They tried multiple mediums and found in each of them something that seemed ultimately more like skilled social performance than genuine communication from the dead. These women are harder to find in the historical record for obvious reasons. They did not write enthusiastically about their experiences. They did not recommend mediums to their friends. They moved quietly away from the practice and left, in most cases, no account of why. But they existed, and their existence is part of the complete picture. One such woman was a Boston widow named Clara Marsh, who wrote, in a private letter that has survived in a family archive, a remarkably clear-eyed account of her experience with 3 different mediums over the course of 2 years in the early 1890s. She had gone to the first medium hoping to hear from her husband, who had died suddenly, and left her feeling that the conversation between them was unresolved. She had heard from him, in a manner of speaking. The medium had produced a communication that sounded, she wrote, like a plausible approximation of her husband's manner. But it had also sounded like something that could have been produced by anyone with a good ear for the general qualities of successful businessmen of a certain class and generation. The second medium had been more specific, producing details that went beyond what the first medium had offered. But Clara Marsh, reviewing the session afterward, had been able to identify the probable sources of each specific detail: a newspaper obituary, a conversation she'd had in the waiting room with another client, a piece of information she realized she had provided herself without intending to in the early minutes of the session. The third medium had produced nothing that felt authentic, and Clara Marsh had left feeling not grief and not comfort, but a specific and unpleasant feeling that she described as the feeling of being handled, of being the subject of a skilled professional's management conducted with sympathy and genuine care, but management nonetheless. She did not return to any of the 3 mediums. She wrote that she had arrived at a position of respectful agnosticism. She could not say with certainty that genuine spirit communication was impossible, but she could say with reasonable confidence that the specific mediums she had tried were not producing it. What she'd found was something more modest and more human. 3 women who were very good at listening and who had developed, through long practice, the ability to reflect a client's own knowledge and desires back to her in a form that felt like communication from outside herself. This was not nothing, she acknowledged. In certain states of grief, it could be genuinely helpful. But it was not what the practice claimed to be. The skeptics and the believers were not, in many cases, as different as the categories suggest. They were women in the same situations, grappling with the same losses. They arrived at different conclusions about what the medium could offer, and those different conclusions shaped what they took away. Both groups, in the end, were doing the same thing, trying to understand what happened to the people they loved when those people died, and trying to find a way to continue existing in a world that those people had left. The afternoon light in October has a quality that is difficult to explain to someone who has not sat in it. It comes through the leaves, which are turning, and through the windows that face the garden, and it falls across the floor in long shapes that shift slowly as the afternoon moves toward evening. It is a warm light, but it contains, unmistakably, the knowledge of winter. It is a light that insists on the beauty of the present moment while the present moment is already passing. The women who sat in this light, in the drawing rooms of the Gilded Age, were accustomed to its quality. They had sat in it for decades since childhood, in the houses where they grew up and in the houses they had made as adults. They knew what it meant. The shortening of the days, the approach of the cold months, the way the world draws in toward itself in preparation for the season of bare branches and frozen ground. They also knew, because they had lived long enough to know it, that the winter was not permanent, that the light would come back, that what appeared to be an ending was in fact a turning, and that the turning, however cold and bare the months it moved through, would arrive eventually at the lengthening days and the return of growth. This knowledge, the long-view knowledge that comes from having lived through enough seasons, was among the most sustaining things that the women in these houses possessed. The knowledge that the loss could be survived, not because it was small or because it would stop hurting, but because it was part of a pattern larger than itself. The medium offered something similar. She offered the long view of the relationship, the perspective from beyond the immediate loss, the sense that the end of the visible part of the relationship was not the end of the relationship itself. Whether this long view was accurate or not, the effect of holding it was the same as the effect of the October light. The knowledge that the present difficulty was part of a pattern that extended beyond it, that the bare and cold months were not the whole of the year, that the turning was already underway. This is the last gift of the medium, and the simplest, the gift of perspective, the gift of the sense that says, this is not the end. The conversation continues. The love does not stop because one of the people doing the loving has died. The afternoon light falls across the floor, the chairs are still in the circle, the fire is out. But something in the room says, not yet over. The October light agrees. It always agrees. The historical record of Gilded Age spiritualism is extensive in some respects and frustratingly thin in others. There are court records. There are newspaper accounts of the séances that became public controversies. There are the records of the Society for Psychical Research, which investigated several dozen prominent mediums with considerable thoroughness. There are the published memoirs and letters of the major families whose names appear in the newspaper archives. What there is much less of are the private records, the diaries of the women who consulted mediums, the accounts of what was said in the sessions that were never meant to become public, the correspondence between women who shared the practice. These records existed in many cases and were deliberately destroyed by the women who made them or by their descendants, who understood that the social costs of the practice had shifted. The silences in the historical record are themselves informative. They tell us that there was something to conceal, that the practice was widespread enough to produce considerable documentation and personal enough to require careful management of that documentation. The cases examined in this telling are not the whole of the history. They are the visible portion of a much larger practice that left many of its most significant traces in the private papers of women who destroyed those papers in the memories of descendants who did not speak of what they had heard. The complete history is not recoverable. What remains is the fragment, the cases that reached the courts, the letters that survived, the accounts that were recorded by people with reasons of their own to record them. From these fragments, a picture assembles itself, not complete, not conclusive, but recognizable. The picture is of women navigating a world with the tools available to them, using the resources that the specific moment provided, doing so with a combination of genuine belief and practical intelligence that the official histories of the period have routinely underestimated. These women deserve to be seen clearly. They deserve to be understood as the strategic and determined and fully human people they were. The drawing rooms are still there, in some of the houses. The walls still hold whatever they hold from the evenings when the curtains were drawn, and the chairs were arranged in a circle, and the voice moved through the stillness. We cannot hear what was said, but we can stand in the doorway and acknowledge that something was said, and that it mattered, and that the women who heard it carried it into the world and did with it what needed to be done. Tonight that is enough. There is one more thing the medium gave that has not been named yet, and it may be the most lasting. She gave the practice of attention. To sit in a room and attend to what is not immediately visible, to hold open the question of what is present when the visible evidence of presence has been removed, to resist the conclusion that absence is simple, that the gone are simply gone, that the conversation has ended because one side of it has fallen silent. The women who built this practice of attention in the drawing rooms of the Gilded Age, through the seasons of their grief and the seasons of their strategic necessity, carried it into everything else they did. They carried it into the management of their estates, where the attention to what was not on the surface of the documents was often the thing that mattered most. They carried it into their social navigation, where the ability to perceive what was happening below the official performance was an asset of incalculable value. They carried it into their relationships with their children and their grandchildren, and the younger women who came to them for guidance. The attention was the inheritance, not the money, though the money mattered, not the legal victories, though those mattered too, the attention. The capacity to sit in a room and listen for what the room contains that the ordinary noise of the day obscures, the capacity to remain present with a question that cannot be answered, and to find, in that presence, not paralysis, but a kind of orientation, a sense of where one is and what one values and what one is there to do. This capacity is not common. It requires cultivation. It requires the willingness to be still in a culture that values motion, to be uncertain in a culture that values confidence, to hold open a question in a culture that values resolution. The medium's room was one place where this cultivation happened. It was not the only place, but it was a place where the specific conditions for it were reliably created. The dimmed lamps, the stillness, the focused and unhurried attention of another person, the explicit commitment to taking seriously what the ordinary world dismissed. The women who attended those sessions were changed by them, not only because of what the medium said, but because of the practice of sitting there, in the half-dark, and attending. This change is not documentable in the way that a settlement amount is documentable, or a change in trust terms, or the transfer of an inheritance. It is the kind of change that shows up in the posture of a person entering a difficult room, in the quality of their listening, in the slowness and precision of their response to a challenge they have had time to feel the full weight of before they answer. The women who had this quality were formidable, not in the ways the world usually names as formidable, not loud or aggressive or dominant, formidable in the way of someone who knows things that are not easily known and has the patience to use that knowing correctly. They passed it on, this quality, the way they passed on everything else they had learned in the difficult decades of their lives, not through formal instruction, through example, through the slow inheritance of a way of being in the world that the daughters and granddaughters absorbed by proximity, by watching, by sitting in the same rooms and learning over years to hear what the rooms contained. This is the deepest inheritance of the Gilded Age medium's practice, deeper than any estate settlement, more durable than any trust amendment. The inheritance of attention. The inheritance of the capacity to sit in the half-dark and listen for what is there. The night is nearly over. In the houses where the medium visited, in the drawing rooms where the circles were formed and the candles burned down to nothing, the first light of morning is beginning to find its way around the edges of the drawn curtains. The city is not yet awake. There are a few sounds, a cart somewhere, horses on cobblestone, the distant sound of something being unloaded at the docks, the first bird in the garden that faces the window. But these are the sounds of the city's earliest preparations, the sounds that precede the day rather than belonging to it. The woman who sat in the séance last night is sleeping now, or nearly sleeping. She has moved through the difficult hours of the night, the hours when the questions were loudest and the absence was most acute, and she has arrived at the margins of morning with something she did not have when the night began. It is not certainty. It is not the resolution of the question that had kept her awake. It is something quieter than either of those things. It is the sense of having been attended to, of having been in the presence of someone who took her grief seriously and her needs seriously and her perceptions seriously and worked, with evident skill and evident care, to give her something that the rest of the world had not provided. It is the sense that the conversation is not entirely over, It is the sense that the people she has loved are not entirely absent. It is, if she's lucky, the beginning of something like rest. The city moves toward morning, the curtains thin against the growing light. The room that was the centre of everything last night is now simply a room, with chairs in a circle and the cold evidence of a candle that burned down to the end. But the woman who was there is changed, imperceptibly perhaps, not in any way that will be obvious to the lawyers or the trustees or the family members who will see her tomorrow, but changed in the way that matters most, in her own understanding of where she is and what she's carrying and what she's there to do. She is there to continue. To take the conversation that was interrupted by death and carry it forward, in the only direction it can go from here, which is into the living world with all its difficulties and all its demands and all the specific, irreducible complexity of being a person who has lost someone and is still here, still required to be present, still required to manage and decide and persist. She is there to continue. And the morning's coming to help her. The light finds the edges of the curtains. The city wakes slowly into the new day. In the room with the circle of chairs, the last of the night releases its hold on the air, and what replaces it is something ordinary and necessary and sufficient. The plain light of a new morning, arriving without ceremony, asking nothing, offering everything. The woman sleeps. The city wakes. The day begins. There is a question that sits underneath everything in this story, and it is worth asking directly before we leave it behind. Were any of the spirits real? Not in the general philosophical sense, not the question of whether life continues after death, which is a question that has occupied the most serious minds in every civilization, and has not been resolved, and will not be resolved here. The specific question, when the women in these houses sat across from mediums and received messages that seemed to come from their dead husbands and fathers and brothers, was any of what came through actually from the dead? The honest answer is, we do not know, and the honest further answer is, the tools we have for knowing are not adequate to the question. The investigators of the psychical research movement were serious and methodologically careful, and they found fraud in case after case, enough fraud to establish beyond reasonable doubt that fraud was common, and that many of the most celebrated mediums of the Gilded Age were producing, at least some of the time, effects that were the products of human ingenuity rather than spirit communication. The evidence for this is substantial and has not been seriously challenged. But the evidence for fraud, even when it is very strong, does not exhaust the evidence for the practice. It establishes that fraud occurred. It does not establish that nothing else occurred. These are not the same claim. There were, in the annals of psychical research, cases that the investigators found genuinely difficult to explain. Cases in which the specific information produced by the medium, the pet names, the private memories, the details of conversations that had taken place between two people and been witnessed by no one, could not be traced to any mundane source the investigators could identify. Cases in which the information was accurate in ways that seemed to require either genuine spirit communication or a form of human knowledge acquisition that was itself inexplicable. These cases were fewer than the fraudulent ones. They were less dramatic. They did not make the same headlines, and they were inevitably contested. Every researcher who found them compelling was challenged by researchers who found alternative explanations or questioned the methodology. The honest position is this. The scientific investigation of spiritualism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries produced strong evidence that fraud was widespread, and inconclusive evidence about whether genuine phenomena occurred alongside the fraud. The honest position does not permit the confident assertion that everything was fraud, because the evidence does not support that assertion, even though it supports the assertion that fraud was common. For the women in the houses on Fifth Avenue and Gramercy Park and Prospect Park West, this epistemological ambiguity was not an obstacle to practice. It was, in a sense, the condition of practice. They sat with mediums in the knowledge that fraud was possible and in the hope that it was not the whole story, and they received whatever came through with the combination of openness and discernment that the situation required. This is not so different from the situation of anyone who engages with a source of knowledge that is both genuinely informative and genuinely fallible. The physician who uses the best available treatment in the knowledge that medicine is imperfect. The historian who relies on documents in the knowledge that documents can be fabricated. the person of faith who believes in the promises of a tradition, in the knowledge that traditions can be corrupted. The women who consulted mediums were not primarily epistemologists. They were women with specific needs in specific circumstances, and they deployed the tools available to them with the pragmatism that their circumstances required. Whether the spirits were real was in the end a question they lived with rather than resolved. What they resolved through practice and through experience was a more tractable question, whether the medium was useful, and the answer to that question, in the cases we have examined, was often yes. Not always. The Hetty Green case failed. There were certainly other cases that failed, cases that ended in humiliation or prosecution or financial loss, cases that have not been preserved because the people involved had reason to prefer that they not be. The strategy was not infallible, no strategy is. But it worked often enough to be worth doing. It worked often enough that the knowledge of it passed from woman to woman, through the social networks of the Gilded Age, through the drawing rooms where the medium was a regular visitor, and the question of how to navigate inheritance was a regular topic of quiet conversation. It worked often enough that it became, in the specific circumstances of its time and place, a genuine resource. One of the few resources that women in these circumstances actually had. This is what was real, definitively and without qualification, the need, and the ingenuity with which the need was addressed. Everything else is a question we're still sitting with, as the candle burns down and the medium finishes speaking, and the two women in the room begin, slowly, to return to the ordinary world. Some of the houses in this story still stand. Not all of them. Many of the great Gilded Age townhouses on Fifth Avenue were demolished in the decades after the First World War, as the families that had built them lost their fortunes or moved to the country, or simply found that the maintenance of a 20-room house in Manhattan was an expense that could no longer be justified by the social benefits it provided. The neighborhood changed. The buildings changed. The block of Fifth Avenue that had been the site of Mrs. Astor's drawing room became eventually something else entirely. But some houses survive, repurposed and renamed but structurally unchanged. The bones of the Gilded Age still visible in the high ceilings and the elaborate mouldings and the windows that look out onto streets that no longer carry the sound of horses. Walking past one of these houses on a late afternoon in autumn, when the light falls through the trees in that particular October way, it is possible to imagine, not very hard, the room on the second floor where the curtains were drawn against the evening. The gas lamps turned low, the chairs arranged in a circle, the woman in dark silk sitting very still, waiting. The medium arrives. She's not theatrical. She sits down, folds her hands, and begins. The house, if it could speak, would have things to say about what happened in that room, about the voices that passed through it, the negotiations that were conducted in its spaces, the fortunes that were redirected or preserved or contested over the course of the long Gilded Age, about the women who came and went through its doors carrying the weight of their needs and the tools they had assembled to address them. But houses do not speak. They hold what happened in them in their walls and their floors and their irreversible geometry, and what they contain cannot be accessed except through the imagination and through the documents that the people who lived in them left behind. The documents are partial. They are always partial. They capture the legal proceedings but not the conversations in the parlour. They capture the settlement amounts but not the months of strategy that produced them. They capture the names of the mediums who were exposed and prosecuted but not the names of the mediums who were neither, who did their work quietly and retired without public notice. What the documents leave out is, in many ways, the most important part of the story. They leave out the sense of a room in late afternoon, the smell of tallow and roses, the particular quality of attention with which a woman listens when the voice she is hearing is the voice she has most wanted to hear since the death that rearranged her world. They leave out the feeling of having been spoken to by someone who knew you completely and loved you without reservation, a feeling that does not come often in ordinary life and that comes more rarely still in the ordinary management of inheritance disputes. They leave out the dreams. The women who consulted mediums in these houses often reported, in their private letters and their diaries, that the séances changed their dreams, that the dead they had been dreaming about, the disordered, frightening dreams of grief, in which the dead appeared in wrong contexts, in wrong states, carrying the wrong expressions, were replaced after the séance by dreams that were calm and right. The dead appeared as they had been in life, occupying the rooms they had occupied, doing the things they had done. The quality of the presence was different. It felt resolved rather than urgent, settled rather than distressed. Whether this was a consequence of genuine communication with the dead, or whether it was the consequence of a psychological resolution that the séance had facilitated, through purely human means, the practical effect was the same. The women slept better. They carried their grief more lightly. They moved through the world with a greater sense of groundedness and authority. This is not a small gift. The management of a complicated estate, the navigation of a difficult legal dispute, the maintenance of a household and a social position, and a family network in the years after a significant loss. All of this is made harder by sleeplessness and grief, and the disordered feeling that the world has become fundamentally unsafe. All of it is made easier by a sense of continued connection to the people who were the organizing centers of one's life before they died. The medium provided this sense, whether she was also a legal strategist, whether she was also a tool in a negotiation, whether she was also a source of leverage in a drawing room. She was, at the same time, always a provider of this more intimate service. She was the person who helped with the dreams. The houses that remain hold this in their walls along with everything else. The parlours where the circles were formed, the rooms where the curtains were drawn, the staircases where the medium arrived and the hallways where she left. Some late afternoons, in the light that comes through the trees in October, you can almost feel it. The quality of attention in those rooms, the particular stillness, the breath held. The waiting. Nothing in the human story is ever quite over. The specific strategy of Gilded Age spiritualism, the deployment of the medium in the service of inheritance disputes, the redirection of fortunes through the voice of the dead, belongs to its time in the way that all strategies belong to the conditions that produced them. The conditions changed. The strategy became less available, less necessary, less effective. The drawing room séance gave way to other forms of practice, the inheritance dispute to other forms of contest, the medium's specific authority to other sources of authority that women gained access to in the decades of the progressive era, and the suffrage movement, and the slow, contested expansion of women's legal rights. But what persists underneath a specific historical form is something more durable. The persistence of grief and the human need for continued connection with the dead is not a feature of the Gilded Age. It is a feature of being human in every age, in every culture, in every arrangement of wealth and law and social organization. People lose people, the loss is permanent and the need for contact is not. The persistence of the desire for authority, for a language in which one's claims can be articulated with weight, in which one's perceptions are treated as valid, in which the case for what one is owed can be made in terms that the people on the other side cannot easily dismiss. This too is not specific to the Gilded Age. It is specific to any situation in which one party has less power than the other and is trying to make a claim that the more powerful party would prefer not to acknowledge. And the persistence of the medium herself, the person who occupies the space between the visible world and the invisible one, who insists that the dead continue to matter, who creates the conditions under which communication with the gone becomes imaginable. This is perhaps the most durable of all. She appears in different forms in different centuries. In one era, she sits behind a table with her hands spread flat and her eyes closed. In another, she practices a form of therapy that uses the language of the unconscious rather than the language of the spirit. In another, she's a novelist who gives voice to the dead in fiction, or a historian who reconstructs the lives of people who have been forgotten, or a daughter who sits in the house where her mother lived and tries to understand what her mother knew. The medium is anyone who takes seriously the claim that the dead are not simply gone, that they left things behind, not just money and property and legal structures, but the less tangible things, knowledge, perspective, a way of understanding the world that is now accessible only through the work of reconstruction and imagination, and the willingness to sit quietly in a room and listen for what the ordinary world is too loud to hear. The women of the Gilded Age who practiced this form of attention, whether they called it spiritualism or strategy or simply the management of difficult circumstances, were doing something that does not require the specific context of the 1880s and 1890s to be recognizable. They were insisting on the continued relevance of the people they had loved. They were refusing to let the legal and financial structures of their world have the last word about what those people had meant and what they had wanted. They were maintaining, in the only space available to them, a conversation that the rest of the world had declared over. The conversation is never entirely over. The houses remember, the documents record fragments, the stories that have been preserved, imperfectly, partially through the accidents of archive and survival, carry forward the voices of women who understood, in ways their world did not credit, that the visible world is not the whole of the world. And in drawing rooms somewhere, in whatever form the drawing room now takes, there are still women sitting in circles, still waiting for something to come through the silence, still holding open the question that the rest of the world has decided is closed. Still listening. Still keeping the conversation alive. The candle has burned very low now. The medium has finished speaking. The two women in the room sit for a moment in the quiet that follows the session, the particular quiet of a space that has held intense attention and is now releasing it slowly, like a room after music has stopped. The woman who came for the session rises first. She does not speak immediately. She gathers herself, the way people gather themselves after something that has moved them, reassembling the ordinary layers of composure and purpose that the outside world requires. She will leave this room and return to the world of lawyers and trustees and the daily management of a complicated situation. She will attend the meeting with the brother-in-law. She will review the documents with her attorney. She will make the calls and write the letters and do the work that needs to be done. But she will do it differently than she would have done it before she came here. She will do it with the sense that she is not alone in it, that the person whose estate is at the centre of the dispute is not simply an absence, a blank space where a person used to be, but is present still in some form that cannot be easily dismissed. She does not need to believe this perfectly or without doubt. She needs only to hold it as a possibility, to carry it into the room as a resource she can draw on when the other side is pressing and the arguments seem to have run out. The medium is putting her things away. She moves quietly, without ceremony, with the contained efficiency of someone for whom the work is ordinary even when it is not. Downstairs the city continues. The smell of coal smoke and horses in the damp October streets comes through the gap in the window someone left open. A carriage somewhere. The distant sound of commerce and motion, and the ordinary machinery of a city that does not know and would not particularly care what has been happening in this room. In this room, something has happened. What exactly, neither woman can say precisely. Something has shifted. Some weight that was sitting in a particular way has been repositioned just slightly, in a direction that makes it easier to carry. The medium says good evening and the woman says good evening, and the woman goes down the stairs and out through the front door and into the October street. She walks for a moment before she thinks about where she's going. She breathes the coal smoke air. She looks up briefly at the sky that is still holding a little light in the west, the last of the afternoon going. She thinks about what the medium said. She thinks that sounded like him. She thinks I needed to hear that. She begins to walk. Thank you so much for spending this evening in the Gilded Houses, listening to the voices that move through them. If this story kept you company as you drifted towards sleep, I am glad. Before you let go completely, a question to carry with you into the quiet. If you could have one question answered by a voice from the past, a parent, a grandparent, or someone whose wisdom shaped your family, what would you ask them? Let that question rest gently. There is no urgency. The morning will come when it comes. For now, let the October light fade. Let the city outside grow quiet. Let the medium put away her things and go home through the evening streets, and let the woman who heard what she needed to hear walk toward whatever comes next, with the sense that she is not alone in it. Sleep well.